The boot came down on her ribs before she even saw it coming. 1 second, Amara Veyne was standing behind the Northline diner counter with her hands raised and her voice steady, telling the 3 men in ski masks that there was no safe because there wasn't one. And the next second, she was on the floor, tasting blood, staring at the grease-stained linoleum while the tallest one leaned over her and said it again, quieter this time, which was somehow worse. "The safe last chance," she told him again. "No safe." Warren kept maybe $400 in the register on a good night. So he kicked her again. If you've ever wondered what it feels like to be beaten for something you don't have, for a secret you can't give up because it doesn't exist, if you've ever asked yourself what you would do, lying on a cold floor with cracked ribs and a man's boot beside your face, then stay with this story. Because what happened next will answer that question in ways you won't expect. Before we go further, if you're new here, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a like if you're already feeling it, and leave a comment with your city and country. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that diner floor. Because the night Amara Veyne almost died was also the night everything in her life finally started moving toward the truth. The Northline Diner sat at the edge of an industrial stretch of Seattle's south waterfront, the kind of block that existed between 2 other blocks that mattered. It had 12 tables, a counter with 8 stools, a coffee machine that worked most of the time, and a neon sign in the window that buzzed when it rained. It rained most nights in Seattle, so the sign buzzed most nights. Amara had stopped hearing it after the first month. That was 4 years ago. She was 26. She worked 5 nights a week, sometimes 6, when Warren called in sick, which happened with increasing regularity. Now that his drinking had gone from something people politely ignored to something that showed up in the afternoon. She covered his shifts because she needed the money, and because the diner needed someone responsible in the building. And because, if she was being honest with herself, in the small hours of the morning, when honesty has nowhere to hide, she'd been covering for people her whole life, and she didn't quite know how to stop. Warren Gable was 54 and had owned the diner for 11 years. He called Amara his best employee, his right hand, occasionally his rock, depending on how many drinks in he was when he said it. He said it often. She had learned to accept the compliment and file away the fact that compliments from Warren generally substituted for raises. It was 2:13 in the morning on a Tuesday when the 3 men came in. Amara was wiping down the counter. The last customer had left 40 minutes earlier, a truck driver named Pete who always ordered the same thing, black coffee, no food, and left $1.50 on the counter, regardless of how long he stayed. The door was supposed to be locked at 2. She'd been about to do it when she heard the bell above the entrance. She looked up expecting a lost tourist or a drunk who needed directions. The first thing she registered was the masks. The second was the size of the one in front, tall enough that he had to angle his head slightly under the doorframe. The third was the gun in his hand, which he pointed at her face, without any of the hesitation she might have imagined in a situation like this, if she'd ever imagined a situation like this, which she hadn't. "Don't move," he said. "Don't scream. Open the register." Amara's hands went up. Her body understood the instruction before her mind finished processing it. She moved to the register. Her fingers weren't shaking. She noticed that with a distant kind of surprise, and she punched it open and stepped back. The second man came around the counter and took the cash without counting it. She watched his hands. Gloved. Everyone's hands were gloved. Tall one hadn't moved. He was watching her. "Where's the safe?" She told him there wasn't one. He looked at her for a moment, the way people look at you when they've already decided you're lying and the question is just a formality. "Try again," she told him again. Warren kept minimal cash on hand. The safe, if there had ever been one, wasn't in this building. She'd worked here 4 years. She would know. The second man came back around the counter and said something to the tall one that Amara didn't catch. The tall one's jaw tightened. Then the third man, who had been standing near the door and hadn't spoken, walked toward her slowly, and Amara's body understood what was coming before her mind did again, and she had exactly enough time to brace herself. Before he shoved her into the counter, hard enough that she hit the edge with her lower ribs. The sound she made wasn't a scream. It was shorter than that. Involuntary. The kind of sound that comes out before you can decide whether to make it. She grabbed the counter to stay upright. The tall one asked her again about the safe. She said there wasn't one. Her voice came out mostly intact. He nodded slowly, like she'd confirmed something for him. Then he said, okay, and she felt momentary, stupid relief. And then his boot connected with the back of her knee, and she went down. The floor was cold. The linoleum was sticky near the dishwasher, from a spill she hadn't finished cleaning. These were the things her mind recorded while her body processed pain that came in waves, sharp at the center and spreading outward through her midsection in a way that made breathing a decision rather than a reflex. She heard them moving around behind her. Drawers, cabinets, the storage room door. They were looking for something specific. She registered that through the pain. They weren't panicked. They weren't rushing. This wasn't desperation. This was methodology. One of them crouched beside her, not the tall one. The third one, who smelled like cigarette smoke and engine oil. $20,000, he said quietly. We were told it was here. So where is it? Amara stared at the floor. She had never in 4 years heard Warren mention $20,000 in cash in this building. She had handled his books enough to know he didn't operate anywhere near those margins. I don't know what you were told, she said. Her voice sounded strange in her own ears. Compressed, but whoever told you that was lying. The man stood up. She heard him say something to the others. Then they locked her in. The front door was key-operated from the outside. She heard the bolt engage. She heard their footsteps cross the parking lot. She heard an engine start and pull away. And then there was nothing but the rain on the windows and the buzzing sign, and the sound of her own breathing, which was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. She lay still for what felt like a long time, taking inventory. Her ribs on the left side were wrong, not just bruised, something worse than bruised. Moving pulled in a way that suggested things had shifted that shouldn't have. Her left knee was swollen already. She could feel it pressing against her jeans. There was blood coming from somewhere on her face. She wasn't sure exactly where. She could not get up. She understood this clearly and without panic, which surprised her. She had expected panic. Instead, there was something more like clarity. Cold and precise, she was alone. The diner was locked. Her phone was behind the counter. She'd seen the third man pocket it during the robbery. She remembered now. The nearest occupied building was a warehouse 2 blocks north that ran a night shift. She had no way to reach it. She had to get to the window. She started moving. It took her 11 minutes to cover 14 feet. She kept track of time using the wall clock she could see from the floor, its second hand moving in the same even circles it always moved in, indifferent to everything happening below it. 14 feet across slippery linoleum with ribs that were making her vision go white at the edges every time she reached forward. She reached the front window at 2:31. She pressed her hand against the glass. It left a print she didn't realize until later that her palm was bleeding. She held it there anyway, if anyone drove past, if anyone looked. The parking lot was empty and dark and absolutely still. She put her forehead against the glass and let herself rest for a moment. Then headlights appeared. A black SUV turned off the service road and entered the parking lot at a slow, deliberate speed. Not a passing car, it was coming here. It rolled to a stop near the diner's side entrance and idled there, and Amara watched it through the glass with the specific, exhausted calculation of someone who has already been hurt once tonight and is trying to determine whether what's come next will be better or worse. The driver's door opened. The man who stepped out was tall, not the same kind of tall as the robber. This was different. The kind of tall that came with stillness rather than aggression. And he was wearing a dark coat, and he moved across the parking lot the way people move when they are accustomed to being the most dangerous thing in any given space. Not hurrying, not looking around nervously, just moving. He saw the handprint on the glass. He stopped. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked through the glass, and his eyes found Amara on the floor, and she watched something move across his face that wasn't exactly shock, more like recognition. Like someone who has seen this particular configuration of events before and carries the memory of it in a place that doesn't heal cleanly. He tried the door locked. He took 2 steps back. Then he drove his elbow through the glass panel beside the door handle. The sound it made was enormous in the quiet parking lot. He reached through without any apparent concern for his own arm, found the interior latch, and pushed the door open. Glass scattered across the entrance mat. He stepped over it and crossed to where Amara was on the floor, and he stopped a few feet away from her, and he did something she would think about for a long time afterward. Crouched down so he was at her level, and he told her what he was going to do before he did any of it. "I'm going to check whether you can be moved," he said. His English was precise, slightly accented. "I won't touch you until you say it's okay." Amara looked at him. She was past the point of making good decisions about who to trust. She was at the point where the only relevant question was whether this man intended to hurt her, and something in the stillness of him, the fact that he was waiting, that he hadn't immediately grabbed her, that he'd announced himself, like someone who understood what it meant to approach. A person who had already been grabbed once tonight told her that he didn't. She said okay. He moved carefully. He checked her ribs without pressing hard enough to make her cry out, though it came close. He looked at her knee. He checked her pupils with the flashlight on his phone. He asked her where the worst pain was, and she told him. And he nodded and didn't tell her that bad, or that she'd be fine, or any of the things people say when they want to make themselves feel better about someone else's pain. He said, "I'm going to carry you to the car. There's going to be a moment when I have to lift you that's going to hurt. I can't avoid it. Tell me when you're ready." She told him she was ready. The lift did hurt. She made the sound again, the short, involuntary one. He didn't flinch or speed up or make a face. He just carried her across the parking lot and got her into the back seat of the SUV with a steadiness that she would later recognize as one of the defining characteristics of who he was. He did difficult things without performing the difficulty. His name was Baek Si-heon, though she didn't learn that until later. He made a call in Korean from the front seat while she lay across the back, watching the Seattle streets past the window, the rain coming down in steady sheets against the glass. She caught fragments. She didn't speak Korean, but his tone was controlled and clipped and certain, the tone of someone issuing instructions to people who would follow them without debate. Car stopped at a building on the waterfront, not a hospital. She noticed that she was too depleted to object. 2 people were waiting at the entrance, a man who turned out to be a physician and a woman with close-cropped hair and sharp eyes who introduced herself as Yirin and touched Amara's shoulder. Once, briefly, and somehow managed to make the gesture feel like a complete sentence. The physician's name was Dr. Cho. He was efficient and thorough and delivered his assessment of Amara's condition with the flat affect of someone who had delivered worse news on worse nights. 2 fractured ribs, internal bleeding, manageable but requiring monitoring. Lacerations on her palms and face. The knee was badly sprained but intact. "Another 30 minutes, he said, not to Amara but to Si-heon, who was standing in the doorway, and the internal bleeding would have become a different conversation. Si-heon said nothing. His expression didn't change. But something shifted in his posture, almost imperceptible. The kind of thing you'd only catch if you were looking very carefully. And Amara, from the bed, was looking carefully. Because she was the kind of person who watched people when she wanted to understand something. He looked like a man absorbing information he'd already been afraid of. She slept, deeply, in a way she hadn't slept in months, which said something about exhaustion and something about whatever doctor Cho had administered, and something, too, about the fact that her body understood it was safe, in a way her mind hadn't caught up with yet. When she woke, the room was gray with early morning light. The door was open. Si-heon was in the hallway, not in the room. Not sitting bedside in the way she half expected. He was in a chair outside the open door, his back to the wall, a tablet in his hand, and he looked up when she stirred, and he said, from the hallway, "Do you want the door closed?" She thought about it. "No," she said. He nodded and looked back at his tablet. He didn't come in. He didn't ask her how she felt or tell her she was lucky or offer her any of the transaction of gratitude he might reasonably have expected given that he'd just saved her life. He simply stayed in the hallway where she could see him and where he could see her. And there was something in the geometry of that, the open door, the maintained distance that Amara understood even through the pain and the fog of sleep. He wasn't guarding her. He was guarding her space. She lay there in the gray morning light and tried to take inventory of her life the way she'd taken inventory of her injuries on the diner floor. Practical, honest, without performance. She had a job she could probably return to once her ribs healed, assuming Warren wanted her back, which he would because she was the only person keeping that place functional. She had a room in a shared apartment that cost more than she could comfortably afford. She had a specific, persistent grief that had worn a groove into her days over the past 14 months, the space where Darius used to be, her older brother, the person who had been the closest thing to family she had left after their mother died. Darius had borrowed $16,000 from someone, cover their mother's final medical expenses. Amara had told him not to, had said she'd find another way, but Darius was the older one and had always made the decisions that felt like protection, even when they turned out to be something else. He'd borrowed the money, and then 14 months ago, he'd disappeared. She had spent those 14 months doing what she always did. Working, covering, searching on the margins of a life that didn't leave much margin. Filing police reports that went nowhere. Walking streets that didn't give anything back. Calling shelters and hospitals and leaving her number and waiting. Nothing. She thought about Darius while the gray light shifted toward white. She thought about the men in the diner and the specificity of what they'd asked for, a specific amount, $20,000, and the way they'd moved, organized and purposeful, like people executing a plan rather than improvising one. Someone had told them the money was there. Someone who knew the diner. Someone who had reason to want Amara out of the picture. She was still working through that thought when Yirin appeared in the doorway with coffee and the expression of someone who has already been awake for several hours and found them productive. "You're thinking about who sent them," Yirin said. Not a question. Amara looked at her. "How long have you been awake?" "Since Si-heon called me at 2:30. She handed over the coffee. "I've been running the plates from the parking lot cameras on the next block." Amara accepted the coffee. "Does Si-heon own those cameras?" "He owns several things on that block." Yirin sat in the chair beside the bed inside the room, which felt like a deliberate contrast to Si-heon's position in the hallway, a division of function rather than interest. The men who were in the diner work for someone named Silas Corvin. Real estate developer, legitimate businesses on the surface. Private lending operation underneath it. The name meant nothing to Amara. She said so. "It will," Yirin said. They weren't random. They were sent for a specific purpose at a specific address on a specific night. Someone gave them the information. Amara drank the coffee. It was better coffee than she'd had in a while, which she noted and set aside. "Warren scheduled me alone last night," she said. "He called in sick. He said there was a cash deposit in the back." Yirin's expression didn't change. But she set her own cup down with a slight controlled precision that told Amara she'd just confirmed something. "The 20,000, Amara said. "Warren told Corvin's people you'd be alone and that the diner was holding a $20,000 cash deposit that night." Yirin's voice was even, matter of fact. That was the story they were given. That's why they came. The room was very quiet. Amara thought about Warren. The way he called her his rock. The way he said she was like family, especially after a few drinks. Especially when she'd just covered another shift, or caught an error in the books, or stayed late to handle something he'd forgotten. A sound like green. She thought about the television interview she didn't know about, yet that would come later, that particular knife, but she was already doing the arithmetic of betrayal, already feeling the shape of it before she had all the numbers. Warrens had sent them to her. She put the coffee cup down carefully on the bedside table and she stared at the wall opposite, and she didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "Tell me everything you know about Silas Corvin." Yirin looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Are you sure you want to start this conversation right now? You have 2 fractured ribs." I'm aware, Amara said. Tell me anyway, and Yirin told her. Corvin's legitimate operation was impressive on paper commercial real estate, development projects, civic partnerships, the kind of portfolio that earned you invitations to charity dinners and economic development committees. A sound lending structure that Yirin described in careful, precise language that made it sound even worse than brutal language would have. Vulnerable borrowers, impossible interest structures, fees that compounded against a principal that never meaningfully decreased. People who came in needing $10,000 and found themselves, 3 years later, owing 8 times that amount, the math engineered to make escape impossible. And when they couldn't pay, which was the design, not the failure, Corvin's people took them somewhere and put them to work. Identification confiscated, movement restricted, debt used as a chain. Amara listened to all of it. She asked 2 questions, where and how many, and Yirin answered both, and Amara absorbed the answers and filed them. Then she asked the question she'd been building toward. Do you have a way to search the names? Yirin looked at her. The borrowers, Amara said. The people trapped in the warehouses. Is there a list? Yirin was quiet for a moment. Then she said, we have access to partial financial records. It would take time to cross-reference. I know a name I need you to look for, Amara said. Her voice was steady. She had worked very hard to make it steady. Because if Yirin said what Amara was beginning, against all previous evidence, to allow herself to consider if the name came back active, if the math told the story she was starting to see. Darius Veyne, she said. Veyne. He borrowed $16,000 about 15 months ago. Yirin looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached for her tablet. The silence while she searched lasted 40 seconds. Amara counted. When Yirin looked up, her expression had changed in a way that was very small and very significant. Amara, she said, and Amara knew before the words. Before the number. Before the status that would appear on the screen if she looked, which she wasn't sure she could look at yet. Because knowing was one thing and seeing was another, and she had spent 14 months not knowing, and her brotherness peering in a debt ledger belonging to a man who trapped people in warehouses was the kind of information that you could not unknow once it entered you. She said, tell me. Said original debt, $16,000. Current balance. She paused, not for effect. Because she was, Amara could see a careful person who understood the weight of what she was about to say. $198,000. The number landed. Status, Amara said. Her voice didn't shake. She didn't know how. Active laborer, Yirin said. He's alive, Amara. He's in one of Corvin's facilities, less than 15 miles from here. Amara looked at the wall, the white wall of a room in a building belonging to a man she hadn't known existed 12 hours ago. Her brother was alive. He was 15 miles away. He had been 15 miles away, probably, for over a year, while she walked streets and filed reports and went to sleep exhausted and woke up still not knowing. The grief and the rage hit at the same time, and for a moment they were indistinguishable from each other. She pressed her hands flat against the mattress. The lacerations on her palms pulled. She let them. Then she said, I need to talk to Si-heon. She didn't say, I want my brother rescued. She didn't say, help me. She thought very carefully about what she actually meant, what she actually wanted, what the shape of in a situation with no clean options and no innocent parties, except the people suffering at the bottom of it. She said, I need to talk to Si-heon, and Yirin went to get him. He appeared in the doorway, still not crossing the threshold without invitation. She found that she'd already come to expect it. Come in, she said. Came in. He stood near the wall with his arms at his sides, and he looked at her with the particular attention of someone who is listening before you speak, which was rarer than it should have been. She said, my brother is in one of Corvin's warehouses. Si-heon said nothing. He waited. She said, I don't just want him out. I want every person in every warehouse out. I want Corvin's records exposed. I want the people who built this thing to answer for it. She paused. I want Warren Gable to answer for it. Si-heon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, all of that is possible. She looked at him. You barely know me. No, he said, but I know what Corvin runs. I've known for a while. Something shifted in his voice. Not guilt, exactly. Something more like the particular weight of a decision that should have been made sooner. I had reasons for not moving on it. None of them were good enough. She held his gaze. And now, he said simply, now I have a better reason. She didn't ask him what that meant. Some things you let stand without pulling on them. Outside the windows, Seattle was fully awake, the waterfront beginning its morning noise, gulls and machinery, and the low hum of the city finding its rhythm. Amara lay in the bed with her cracked ribs and her shredded palms, and her brother's name burning in her chest, like something she'd swallowed whole. She thought about Darius, the way he'd always made the decisions that felt like protection. The $16,000 borrowed in love turned into a chain. She thought about Warren, about what it meant to be called someone's rock, and then to learn what that person was actually standing on. She thought about the buzzing neon sign in the diner window and the cold linoleum and the 14 feet she'd crawled on her own, and she thought, no one is coming to save you, but sometimes people arrive in time. And that is not the same thing, and it matters that you know the difference. I'm going to need to see the financial records myself, she said. Not just the summary, everything. Si-heon said, Yi-rin will set you up when you're ready. I'm ready now. He looked at her for a moment. Then, and this was the first time she saw it, the corner of his mouth moved not quite a smile, something more restrained than that, something that acknowledged her without condescending to her. I'll tell her, he said and left. The door stayed open. Amara picked up the coffee Yi-rin had left, found it still warm, and drank it, and began in her mind the architecture of what came next. Not rescue, not revenge, something more durable than both of those things. The storm the previous night, and Seattle was cold and clear through the window, the kind of morning that looked like a beginning even when you hadn't chosen it. She had not chosen any of what had happened in the past 8 hours. But she was here. Darius was alive. The men who had built their fortunes on people like him were still, for now, comfortable and untouched. For now, Yi-rin brought the records in 3 separate folders and set them on the bed beside Amara without explanation or apology for the volume which Amara appreciated. She didn't need things explained. She needed things shown. She opened the first folder. The financial architecture of Silas Corvin's lending operation looked, on the surface, like paperwork. That was the genius of it and the obscenity of it simultaneously. It was all written down, all documented, all formatted with the bureaucratic tidiness of something designed to survive legal scrutiny. Interest rate schedules, fee structures, penalty clauses written in language that sounded reasonable until you followed the math far enough to see where it was designed to go. Amara had done Warren's books for 4 years. She understood numbers the way some people understood weather, intuitively, bodily, before the analysis finished running. She understood these numbers within 20 minutes. The design was elegant in the way that traps are elegant. You borrowed $10,000. The interest rate was listed as 18% annually, which sounded harsh but survivable. What wasn't listed, prominently buried in subsection 4 of a 12-page agreement written in 8-point font, was the fee structure. Processing fees, administrative fees, compliance fees that triggered automatically if a payment arrived more than 3 days early or more than 1 day late. A reassessment fee charged every 90 days, regardless of payment history. Each fee individually was modest. Together, over time, they functioned like water finding the lowest point. Constant, patient, inevitable. A borrower making faithful payments every month would find at the 12-month mark that their principal had increased. Amara put the folder down. She pressed her fingers against her eyes for a moment. Her ribs pulled when she breathed too deeply, so she was breathing shallowly, which made everything feel slightly airless, which was appropriate given what she was reading. She picked the folder back up. Darius had borrowed $16,000. He had, according to the records, made 9 payments before his employment records disappeared from the file and were replaced with a different category of entry. Labor credit, $30 a day against a balance that was growing faster than $30 a day could address. The math was not subtle once you saw it. The math was not subtle, and someone had built it this way on purpose and sat in an office somewhere and looked at the structure and decided it was acceptable. Current balance was $198,000. Darius had been in a warehouse for over a year. She closed the first folder and opened the second. The second folder was worse. It contained names. 47 of them, with debt histories and labor credit ledgers and, in many cases, a small notation in the margin that Yi-rin had flagged with a yellow tab. Amara looked at one of the flagged entries and then looked at Yi-rin, who was sitting in the chair near the wall with her tablet and the specific watchful patience of someone who has decided to let information land at its own speed. "What does the notation mean?" Amara asked. "Cross-reference with the third folder," Yi-rin said. Amara opened the third folder. It took her a moment to understand what she was looking at. When she did, she set the folder on the mattress very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands are less trustworthy than you'd like them to be. Referral payments. Someone had referred Darius Veyne to Corvin's lending operation. Someone had received $2,000 for that referral. The entry listed a business name, Northline Diner LLC, and a signatory, Warren Gable. She had known it was coming. Yi-rin had told her enough that morning that the shape of it was visible. Knowing it was coming did not make it land differently. The body processes betrayal the way it processes certain injuries. The anticipation doesn't reduce the impact. It just gives you a slightly longer window in which to watch it arrive. Warren had sent Darius to Corvin. Warren had received money for it. Then, 14 months later, Warren had scheduled Amara alone in the diner, told Corvin's enforcers there was $20,000 on site, and gone home. She sat with that for 30 seconds. Exactly 30 seconds. She counted. Then she said, "How many referrals did Warren make total?" Yi-rin had clearly already run this. 7 confirmed. Possibly more that we haven't connected yet. All employees? 5 current or former employees. 2 were people he referred from outside neighbors, acquaintances. People in difficult financial circumstances who trusted him. Amara thought about the word trusted. She thought about the way Warren said her name when he was grateful, warm, genuine sounding, the voice of a man who meant it. She had always believed he meant it. She had not been stupid to believe it. She understood now, targeted, selected, assessed for usefulness and kept close, and protected right up to the moment she was more useful as a sacrifice than as an employee. She said, see all 7 files. Yi-rin brought them. Amara spent the next 2 hours reading. Her ribs hurt. She didn't move from the bed. Yi-rin brought her more coffee and a plate of food she ate mechanically without tasting it and kept reading. Si-heon appeared in the doorway once, looked at her, looked at the folders spread across the bed, and left without speaking. She didn't find this strange. She found it correct. By the time she set the last file down, she had a complete picture. Not the full picture, there were gaps, missing records, things that would require more time and more access, but a complete enough picture to understand the architecture. Corvin's lending operation fed his warehouse operation the way a river feeds a reservoir. The lenders recruited the desperate borrowed. The math trapped them. The enforcers collected them. The warehouses consumed them, and sitting at various points along that pipeline, like turnstiles, were people like Warren, recruiters, people with access to the vulnerable, trusted by them, paid modestly to open the gate. She thought about the word modest. $2,000. Warren had received $2,000 for her brother. She thought, he probably spent it on whiskey. She said to Yi-rin, who had not left, "Where does Corvin sit in all of this? Not operationally. Personally. What does he care about?" Yi-rin considered. His reputation. The legitimate side of his business is his armor. He spent 20 years building a public identity, civic leader, job creator, economic development. He has a gala appearance coming up in 3 weeks. The Emerald Commerce Gala. He's receiving an award. Amara looked up from the files. An award for what? Outstanding contribution to Seattle's economic development. Yi-rin's voice was neutral. Impressively neutral. Amara held the information for a moment. Who else attends? Politicians, business leaders. Media, it's a significant event. Yi-rin paused. Warren Gable has been invited. He appears on the guest list as a civic partner. Corvin's people have used the diner for several community meetings over the years. And the police captain, Sloan. Yes, he'll be there. Amara looked at the folders spread across the bed. 47 names, 7 referrals. 14 months of her brother in a warehouse 15 miles from where she'd been serving coffee and covering for a man who'd sold him there. She said, 3 weeks is enough time. Yurin said, carefully, for what exactly? Amara said, to build something that doesn't fall apart. She wasn't ready to say more than that yet. The shape of it was in her mind, but it was still fragile, the way plans are fragile at the beginning before they develop the structure to hold their own weight. She needed to think. She needed, more immediately, to get out of this bed and stand up and move, because lying still was making everything feel like something happening to her, rather than something she was inside of. She pushed herself upright. The ribs informed her loudly of their opinion. She ignored them with the focused determination of someone who has spent her whole adult life ignoring things that hurt, because stopping wasn't an option. Yurin stood up reflexively. I'm fine, Amara said. She wasn't specifically, but she was functional, which was the relevant metric. She stood beside the bed and let her body adjust to vertical and looked at Yurin steadily. I need to walk. And I need you to tell me what access Si-heon has to Corvin's financial records. Not the copies you already have, the live systems. Yi-rin studied her. That's a different question than I expected. I know. Amara took a careful breath. Can you answer it? Yi-rin said, come with me. She led Amara down the hallway. The building was larger than the room had suggested, a converted waterfront property with high ceilings and the particular quality of light that came off open water. Gray and flat and somehow clarifying to a room that Amara would later come to think of as the nerve center. 3 monitors, databases that Yurin navigated with the speed of someone who had built the access architecture herself and knew every door. A secondary system that appeared to run independently of the primary network. Sion was in the room, standing near the window. When they came in, he turned and looked at Amara with the same quality of attention he'd given her from the diner floor, complete, without being invasive. He said, you shouldn't be on your feet. I know, she said. I need to be anyway. He said nothing further on the subject. He moved to a chair and sat, which she understood as an accommodation. If she wasn't going to sit, he would, so the dynamic wasn't him standing over her while she stood in pain. She noted it, filed it. She said, I want to help Yi-rin go through the records. I'm not asking you to do this for me. I'm telling you what I'm going to do and asking whether you'll let me use your resources to do it. Si-heon looked at her for a moment. You already have access, he said. Yi-rin would have given it to you if you asked. Amara said, I wasn't asking Yi-rin. I was telling you. There was a beat of silence. Yi-rin, behind Amara, made a small sound, might have been the beginning of something, and then stopped. Si-heon said, all right. He said it the way you say something. When you've reassessed a situation and the reassessment has gone in a direction you didn't expect and you're deciding whether to acknowledge that. He said it simply, and then he looked back at the window, and Amara turned to Yi-rin and said, show me the live financial access. They worked through the afternoon. Amara was not a trained investigator. She was a woman who had done the books for a failing diner for 4 years and had a particular, angry intelligence and 14 months of accumulated desperation to fuel the work. She found things Yi-rin had missed not because she was more skilled, but because she was looking for different things. She knew how desperate people thought about money. She knew the specific grammar of financial shame, the decisions that look irrational from the outside and make complete sense from inside, the terror of not having enough. She could read the borrower's records, not as data points, but as people. She found 3 additional referral connections in the afternoon that Yi-rin hadn't flagged. She found something else at 4 o'clock that made her stop typing. She sat very still for a moment. Then she said, Yi-rin. Yi-rin came and looked at the screen. The silence lasted about 10 seconds. He has life insurance policies on employees, Yi-rin said. It wasn't a question. Warren does, Amara said. On at least 4 people I can see. Beneficiary is a holding company that traces back to Northline Diner LLC. She pulled up the specific document, including one on me, taken out 18 months ago. Yurin said very quietly, 18 months ago. Before Darius disappeared, Amara said. Before the robbery. He was planning contingencies. She looked at the screen. The policy amount for Amara Veyne was listed at $250,000. If I'd died last night, he would have collected, Yurin said. The room felt colder than it had a moment before. Not physically colder. The other kind. Amara thought about Warren on television. She didn't know yet about the television interview that specific wound was still coming, but she understood now the complete shape of what Warren had built. Not a desperate man making a terrible decision. A man who had cultivated relationships with vulnerable people for years with the patient, systematic awareness that they might be useful to him dead. She had called him family. She had covered his shifts. She had caught his accounting errors and corrected them quietly so no one would see his failures. Because she had believed, genuinely believed, that he was someone who needed protection. And she had been the kind of person who provided that to people who needed it. She said, I want to be the one who builds the evidence package. Yurin said, Amara, not alone with you, but I want to build it. She turned from the screen. These people, the 47 names. Darius, the people in the warehouses. They're not evidence to me. I need to be the one who puts it together. Because if I'm not, there will be gaps. Gaps only someone who knows what it's like to be on the wrong end of this kind of system would see. Yurin looked at her for a long moment. Okay, she said. And I want access to Warren's current financial records. Everything after the robbery. If he's expecting to collect that insurance policy, there will be a record of him preparing to access the funds. Yurin nodded slowly. That will take longer. I have 3 weeks before the gala. Si-heon appeared in the doorway. He had been, Amara suspected, in the adjacent room since they'd started working, close enough to be present without inserting himself. She was learning the way he occupied space deliberate, aware, always with a clear line between proximity and intrusion. He said, there's something you need to see. The something was on the main television in the building's front room. A recorded segment from a local morning news broadcast. Warren Gable, standing outside the Northline Diner, which had police tape across the door and a small cluster of cameras around him. He was wearing a gray shirt and he looked tired in the specific way that people look tired when they want you to know they've been suffering. His eyes were appropriately wet. His voice broke at exactly the right moment. He said on camera, Amara was like family to me. I can't even process what happened in there. She was the heart of this place. He stopped. Pressed his fingers to his eyes. We just want her to be okay. Amara stood in the middle of Si-heon's front room and watched Warren Gable perform grief for her on television. She watched him do it twice because the segment replayed. She had no word for the specific sensation in her chest. It wasn't rage was too hot. It was something colder and more structural. It was the feeling of a belief she had held for 4 years collapsing completely, not gradually, but at once, like a building whose foundation had been quietly failing for years, finally meeting the one stress it couldn't absorb. She had protected him. She had protected him, and he had sold her brother and put a price on her death and stood in front of cameras weeping. She said to no one specifically, he knows I'm alive. Si-heon said yes. He knows because if I was dead, people would be looking for my body. The fact that police are at the diner and I'm not in a morgue means he knows I survived. He'll try to find out who has you, Yurin said. If he believes you've talked to anyone, he'll warn Corvin. Amara looked at Si-heon. Does Corvin know you're involved? Not yet. His voice was flat. My men who came to the warehouse after you were identified, they weren't mine. Borrowed personnel. Nothing traceable. She absorbed this. He had been careful even before she asked him to be, which told her something about how his mind worked. She filed it. She said, then we have a window. Warren knows I'm alive, but not who has me. Corvin knows the robbery failed, but not why or what happened after. We have time before they coordinate. Narrow time, Yurin said. Narrow is enough, Amara said. I need one more thing before we talk about the gala. Si-heon said Darius. She hadn't said it yet. He'd said it for her. She looked at him, and he held her gaze without apology. "I need to know he's safe," she said. "Not extracted yet. Not yet if he disappears from the warehouse now. Corvin knows something is wrong, and we lose the element of surprise. But I need to know she stopped. The word she needed was alive. She'd been told he was alive, but she hadn't seen it. And the difference between being told and seeing was, at this particular moment in her life, vast. I need eyes on him. Si-heon was already reaching for his phone. He made 2 calls. The first in Korean, brief and instructional. The second to someone who spoke English and whose name she never caught, but who apparently had the ability to put a person near the warehouse within the hour. 90 minutes later, a photograph arrived on Si-heon's phone. He looked at it. Then he crossed the room and handed the phone to Amara. It was a grainy long-lens image, a loading dock. Several men in work clothes moving boxes. To sound see. She scanned the faces and found him in the back left corner, thinner than she remembered, his shoulders carrying something they hadn't carried before, the weight of a year that had been designed to break him. But it was Darius. The jaw she knew. The way he held his head slightly forward when he was tired, which she'd teased him about since they were kids. She stood with Si-heon's phone in her hands for a long moment. Then she handed it back without speaking and walked to the window and stood with her back to the room until she was sure her face was her own again. Nobody said anything. Nobody offered comfort. She was grateful for that. Comfort at that moment would have been an intrusion. Silence was the right language. When she turned around, her face was composed and her voice was level. She said, 3 weeks. Here's how I want it to work. She talked for 20 minutes without stopping. The gala, the audio-visual system, the evidence package and how she intended to build it, what it needed to contain, the specific documents and recordings and financial records that would be unignorable in a room full of journalists and politicians. She talked about the warehouses and the timing of the raids, how they needed to coordinate with federal investigators, not Si-heon's people, because what happened in that ballroom needed to result in prosecutions that stuck, and prosecutions that stuck required law enforcement, and law enforcement required evidence delivered through channels they could use. Si-heon listened. He asked 3 questions, all of them practical. When did Yi-rin need access to the gala's audiovisual contractor? How were they going to get the evidence to federal investigators without revealing the source? A sound like green wood splitting told her he'd been thinking about longer than the 20 minutes she'd been talking. What happened to Corvin's warehouse workers during the window between now and the gala? Corvin can't know anyone is watching until we're ready, he said. But those people are in there right now. I know, Amara said. 3 weeks is a long time, I know. She met his eyes. I don't have a perfect answer for that. I have the answer that gives us the best chance of getting everyone out and making sure the people who put them there don't walk out of a courtroom 6 months later on a procedural dismissal. She paused. Can your people watch without being seen? Make sure no one is moved, no one is hurt worse than they already are? He said yes, she said. Then that's the compromise I'm asking you to make with me. The room was quiet. He said, agreed. The next 10 days had a particular texture, dense and slightly surreal, the way the period before something significant always is, time feeling simultaneously too fast and thick enough to push against. Amara moved from the bed to the workroom and back, her ribs complaining less, each day, as the acute stage passed into chronic, and she learned to carry the pain as part of the landscape. She and Yi-rin built the evidence package from the financial records outward, cross-referencing, verifying, documenting the chain of connection from each warehouse worker, back through the debt ledger, back through the referral payments, back to the names that signed the checks. Warren's name appeared 37 times in the final document. Corvin's appeared 412 times. The recording they found on day 8 was the piece that changed the architecture of everything. Yi-rin had been running audio files pulled from a digital backup of Corvin's private business line, illegal to obtain, inadmissible in court on its own, but useful as a roadmap to admissible evidence. Most of the recordings were mundane, business calls, scheduling, 2 that were incriminating in ordinary ways. The one from 6 weeks before the diner robbery was not ordinary. Yirin played it for Amara without preamble. The audio quality was imperfect phone recording, ambient noise, but the voices were clear enough. Corvin's voice first, discussing the diner, the cash story, the schedule of the robbery. Methodical and unbothered, the voice of a man discussing logistics rather than a human life. Then Warren. If she doesn't make it, Warren says, collect the policy. She's replaceable. Amara listened to it once. Then she said, play it again. She listened to it again. She listened to Warren's voice say those words in the particular cadence of someone who had thought about it enough that it no longer required emotional energy. Not vicious, practical, which was somehow worse than vicious. She said, can you clean the audio? Somewhat, Yirin said. It will be identifiable. If it were played in a room where people knew Warren's voice. 400 people will be in that room, Amara said. And Warren will be one of them. She had not told Si-heon about the recording yet. She brought it to him that evening. She brought it to him, played it on a portable speaker in the front room, while the waterfront went dark outside the windows, and the lights of the shipping lane appeared one by one in the distance. He listened without moving. When it finished, he said nothing for a moment. Then he said that about you specifically. Yes, before the robbery. 6 weeks, Si-heon's jaw moved slightly. Something instead of shouldered, shifted in a way that Amara had learned to read in the 10 days she'd been in this building, as the outer expression of an internal process that didn't make it to his face. He was angry, controlled and angry, and the control cost him something, which she could see in the careful stillness of his hands. He said, the recording goes in the package. The recording goes in the package, she confirmed. They looked at each other across the room for a moment in which neither of them said anything that needed saying. That night, she was sitting in the kitchen. She'd started doing that in the evenings, migrating to the kitchen because it was warmer, and because cooking, or attempting to cook with limited mobility, gave her hands something to do besides shake when she heard Si-heon come in behind her. Cracked an egg on the edge of the bowl. Her left hand was still not fully cooperative, and the egg went off angle and fell apart, shell fragments and all, onto the counter and down to the floor. She stood very still. In every kitchen she'd been in before this one, broken things meant something was coming. Not always, but often enough that her body had built the association without her permission. She heard Si-heon move behind her. He crouched down and cleaned the floor. He stood up, opened the refrigerator, took out another egg, and placed it on the counter beside her hand. Then he moved to the stove and turned on the burner beneath the pan that was already there and went back to whatever he'd come into the kitchen for. He did not comment on the broken egg. He did not look at her with the particular expression that accompanied grace being granted. That look that said, I am choosing to be kind about this. Note that I am choosing. He simply cleaned the floor and provided another egg and continued with his evening as if nothing of significance had occurred. Amara stood at the counter with the replacement egg in her hand and felt something move through her that she didn't have a name for. Not gratitude exactly. Something more structural than that. The recognition of a standard she hadn't known to look for until she saw it demonstrated. She cracked the second egg cleanly and kept cooking. The week before the gala, Yirin secured the audiovisual access through Si-heon's technology contractor, a man named Park, who asked no questions and received no explanations, the particular professional courtesy of people who operated in spaces where too much information was a liability. The access was tested and confirmed. The evidence package was complete. Copies had been prepared for federal investigators in a format that traced back to an anonymous source with no fingerprints, literal or digital, that led to Si-heon's operation. Amara delivered the federal package herself. Through a contact Yirin had built years earlier, a woman named Reyes, who worked financial crimes and had a reputation for protecting sources the way other people protected valuables. Amara met her in a parking garage in downtown Seattle and handed over a drive and a printed index and answered 4 questions and went back to the car where Yirin was waiting and sat down and looked at the ceiling. That's out, Yirin said. That's out, Amara confirmed. There's no pulling it back now. Amara looked at the parking garage ceiling for another moment. She thought about Darius In the photograph, the forward tilt of his head when he was tired, the year he'd been inside that building, while she'd been 14 miles away searching the wrong places. She said good. 2 days before the gala, Si-heon sat down with her in the front room and told her about his mother. He didn't preface it. He didn't create a context. He simply said, after a period of silence that had been comfortable rather than vacant, "My mother worked 3 jobs when I was a child. My father wasn't a good man. She was injured several times, and she didn't go to the hospital because she couldn't afford to stop working." Amara didn't say anything. She listened. "When I was 14, he said, she was hurt badly enough that she couldn't hide it. By the time she got real help, he stopped. The stopping was doing work that words would have done less cleanly. I was 14, and I could not do anything about any of it. That was the first time I understood what it meant to be without power in a situation that required it." He said it without performing it. No calculated pause. No orchestrated emotion. Just a man stating a fact he'd been carrying for long enough that it had become part of the way he understood everything else. Amara said, "Is that why you stopped?" He looked at her. "In the parking lot," she said. "You could have called an ambulance and driven away. Whatever meeting you were there for, you could have left. You didn't." She held his gaze. "I've been wondering why." Si-heon was quiet for a moment. "Because I saw the handprint," he said. "And I knew what it meant. Someone was alive in there, and trying and running out of time. And he seemed to consider the next word carefully. I had the ability to do something about it. Not calling it in and leaving. Actually doing something." He looked at his hands briefly. "I wasn't too late this time," he said. Amara was quiet. Then she reached across the space between them and took his hand. Not urgently, not dramatically. The way you reach for something that has earned the reaching. His hand was still for a moment, and then he turned it and held hers back. Neither of them said anything else about it that night. The day before the gala, Si-heon's people moved on the warehouse. Not an extraction, not yet. A repositioning. Si-heon's men embedded near the facility shifted their surveillance to active coverage, close enough to intervene if anything changed, close enough to ensure that when the moment came, the coming out would be clean. Darius was identified by position. The 11 other workers were mapped. Amara spent the day before the gala finishing the evidence package index, reviewing the audio-visual sequence Yi-rin had prepared, and sitting in the kitchen in the late afternoon, with a cup of coffee she didn't drink, thinking about the morning she'd spent crawling across 14 feet of diner linoleum toward a window that looked out at nothing. She thought about the 47 names, the referral payments, courting. She thought about the word replaceable, said in the voice of a man who had looked at her, who had known her for 4 years, who had called her family and found in her nothing more than a number on a ledger. She thought, tomorrow he will learn that she has not been replaced. Tomorrow everyone in that ballroom would learn it. She put the coffee down, stood up, her ribs barely registered now. Pain reduced to a background awareness, rather than an event, and walked to the window and looked out at the waterfront, where the shipping lights moved in the dark water, and Seattle spread its electric map in every direction, and somewhere in the south of the city, inside a warehouse with no windows, her brother was moving through another evening that he hadn't chosen. One more day. She turned from the window and went to find Yi-rin to do the final review, and she did not look back at the dark water, because the dark water was behind her now, and everything that mattered was in front of her, and she had never, in her life, been someone who waited for the right moment when the right moment was something she could build. The morning of the gala arrived the way bad days sometimes do, clear, cold, ordinary-looking, nothing in the sky suggesting what the hours contained. Amara was up at 5:30. She hadn't slept well, which she'd expected, and she didn't waste energy being annoyed about it. She dressed in the dark and went to the workroom and pulled up the evidence package index for the last time. Not because she needed to review it, she had it memorized by now. Every document in sequence. Every timestamp cross-referenced, but because the act of looking at it grounded her in something concrete, when the rest of the morning felt like standing at the edge of a height. Yi-rin arrived in the workroom 20 minutes later with coffee and the particular expression she wore when she had information that hadn't existed the night before. Amara looked at her. Tell me, she said. Yirin set the coffee down. Captain Sloan made 3 calls last night. 2 to Corvin's personal line. 1 to a number we've been tracking that belongs to a private security firm Corvin uses for event coverage. She paused. The calls were short. We don't have the content. Amara processed this. He's nervous. He may have heard something. A rumor, an inconsistency, we don't know what triggered it. Yirin sat down. Security firm, he called. They provide event staff. Gala security is partially outsourced to them. So Corvin's people will be inside the ballroom. Some of them. In uniform, 3, possibly 4, Yirin held Amara's gaze. It doesn't change the plan. The federal agents will be staged at the exits before the event begins. The audiovisual access is confirmed. Park tested it 40 minutes ago. Amara drank the coffee. Does Si-heon know about the calls? He's been awake since 4. He knows. She found him in the front room, standing at the window, the waterfront still dark outside, a few early lights moving on the shipping lane. He was dressed already dark suit, no tie yet, and he didn't turn when she came in, a sound like green wood splitting, which meant he'd heard her footsteps and identified them, and determined she didn't need him to acknowledge her entrance, which was accurate. She said, Sloan is jumpy. Jumpy men make mistakes, Si-heon said. Or they make moves. He turned then. He looked at her in the particular way he'd been looking at her for the past 2 weeks, fully, without the social habit of occasionally glancing away. How are you? She considered the question seriously rather than deflecting it. Functioning, she said. Ask me again in 12 hours. Corner of his mouth moved. She said, What's the exposure if Sloan tries to pull the event security before the presentation? The federal staging is independent of event security. Agents are in place by 4 this afternoon. The gala starts at 7. There's no scenario in which Sloan can have the building cleared without triggering exactly the kind of attention Corvin can't afford. He paused. Corvin won't let him do it. Whatever Sloan's instincts are telling him, Corvin has more to lose from a scene at his own award ceremony than from whatever he thinks might be coming. He doesn't know what's coming, Amara said. That's still true. That's still true. She had 3 hours before they needed to leave. She spent one of them with Yirin running the final technical check audiovisual sequence confirmed, evidence drive confirmed. The federal contact Reyes had sent a coded message that morning that Yirin translated as, assets in position, proceed as planned. She spent a second hour room she'd been using, sitting on the edge of alone in the room she'd been using, not meditating or preparing or doing any of the things that the situation might have called for in a story with cleaner edges. She thought about Darius. Si-heon's people had confirmed that morning that Darius and the 11 other workers were still in the facility, still in position. The extraction team, 8 of Si-heon's trusted people, plus 2 of the federal agents who would split from the gala staging, would move on the warehouse at 8 p.m., coordinated with the moment the evidence hit the ballroom screens. While Corvin was being handcuffed on a stage in front of 400 people, his warehouses would be opening. She had thought very carefully about whether to involve Si-heon's people in the extraction alongside federal agents. She'd had the conversation with Si-heon directly 2 nights earlier, laying out the risk. His involvement in a federal operation complicated his own exposure. He'd said, without hesitation, that he wasn't asking his people to participate in the arrest, only the extraction, the physical act of opening doors and getting people out before the warehouse management could react. The federal agents would take custody from there. She had said, and you trust your people to stay on the right side of that line? He had said, I've been getting my people to stay on the right sides of lines for 15 years. That's the only reason we're still operational. She had accepted it. Now, sitting on the edge of the bed in the gray morning of what she had spent 3 weeks building toward, she tried to locate fear in herself and found it a cold, specific presence in the center of her chest. Not paralyzing, but textured, something she could feel the edges of. That was good. Fear without texture was panic. Fear with texture was information. She got up and started getting ready. The gala was at the Meridian Center. convention facility on Seattle's upper waterfront that had hosted everything from trade conferences to political fundraisers and had the particular polished anonymity of a space designed to make any event look equally important. Amara had looked up photographs of the ballroom weeks earlier: high ceilings, perimeter screens capable of running coordinated audiovisual content, a main stage with a podium flanked by 2 additional displays panels. That was where Corvin would stand when he received his award. That was where the screens would change. She arrived with Si-heon at 6:40, 20 minutes before the event opened to guests. He had said simply, 2 days earlier, "You're coming in on my arm," not as an instruction but as a statement of logistics, because his name was on the guest list through a legitimate civic partnership, and hers wasn't, and the simplest entry was the correct one. She had said fine. She had bought a dress the day before Yirin had arranged it, a delivery. Something dark and structured that would survive the evening without requiring her attention, and she wore it now with the particular uprightness of someone who has learned to carry themselves through painful situations by deciding that posture is the one thing they can control. The lobby of the Meridian Center was already filling with the specific kind of crowd that gathers at events like this, the city's successful and influential and well-intentioned, mixed with the city's successful and influential and completely without scruple. And the art of this particular room was that you could not always tell which was which from the outside. She saw Warren Gable 9 minutes after they entered. He was near the bar with 2 men she didn't recognize, holding a drink and talking with the ease of someone having a good evening. He was wearing a suit that was slightly too formal for him, the way his suits always were, because Warren bought suits for the person he wanted to appear to be rather than the person he was. He hadn't seen her yet. She watched him for exactly 4 seconds. Then she looked away and kept moving. Si-heon beside her said nothing. He had felt the slight change in her pace she knew he had, because nothing in their vicinity escaped him, and he simply adjusted his own without comment. They moved through the lobby toward the ballroom entrance, and she didn't look back at Warren. She didn't need to. She knew where he was. She would know where he was for the rest of the evening. Corvin she spotted at 7:15, once the ballroom had filled enough that movement was natural. He was in the center of a cluster near the stage, taller than she'd expected from photographs, broad through the shoulders, the physicality of someone who had spent their career requiring other people to take up less space. He was smiling. The smile was good. The smile was the kind that closed distances and opened wallets and made rooms feel warmer than they actually were. She watched him smile at a city councilwoman. She watched the councilwoman smile back. Amara took a glass of water from a passing tray and stood beside Si-heon and let the room move around her. Then her phone vibrated. She looked at it. A message from Yirin, who was in a vehicle outside with access to the audio-visual system and a direct line to Park, who was in a utility room below the ballroom with the override console. The message said, "Sloan just entered with 2 additional personnel. Not on the guest list. Building security let them through." She showed it to Si-heon without speaking. He read it. His expression didn't change. He took out his own phone and typed something brief and put it back. She typed back to Yirin, "Positions?" Yirin responded, "Main entrance, east corridor, and one near the stage left access door." Stage left access door. Amara looked across the ballroom to the left side of the stage. There was a man there she hadn't clocked before, event staff uniform, standing with the practiced stillness of someone who was not actually event staff. She had a 3-second window of looking before it became noticeable, and she used all 3 seconds and looked away. She typed "Federal contact aware, Yirin alerting Reyes now." She put the phone away and turned slightly toward Si-heon and said, very quietly, "The stage." Quietly, I saw. "If they pull Corvin before the presentations." "They won't." His voice was certain without being loud. "Corvin is about to receive an award in front of cameras. He's not going to let Sloan make a scene. Whatever Sloan is doing, Corvin hasn't authorized a move." He looked at the stage. "Sloan is scared and covering himself. He's not here to stop the event." Amara breathed. "Then what is he here to stop?" Si-heon said, "Us." She understood. Sloan didn't know what was coming, not specifically, but he knew something was wrong, and he'd positioned himself to manage it when it surfaced. He wasn't here to protect Corvin from an abstract threat. He was here because if something went sideways tonight, he wanted to be the man controlling the aftermath. A corrupt cop's instinct for self-preservation. It made its own logic. The program began at 7:30. Introductory remarks from a woman Ventures, who had the practice warmth of someone who ran these events for a living, the Saintern, and was very good at it. She thanked the assembled guests, outlined the evening's agenda, referenced the award that would be presented to Silas Corvin as the centerpiece of the night. Applause, comfortable and collective. Amara stood near the right side of the room with Si-heon 2 steps to her left and felt the evening moving toward its point like a current she was inside of, rather than observing. Her phone vibrated again. This time the message was from a number she didn't recognize. It took her 3 seconds to understand what she was reading. The message said, "They found your federal contact. Reyes is burned. Package is compromised. You have maybe 20 minutes before Sloan pulls this apart." She read it twice. She looked up. The room was the same room. It had been 30 seconds ago the same ballroom, same crowd, same chandeliers, same man at the podium thanking donors. But the information in her hand had just restructured everything. She showed the phone to Si-heon. He read it. She watched him read it, watched the fraction of a second in which the information landed and he processed it, and the fraction of a second after that in which he was already somewhere past the landing, already moving toward the response. He said, "Who sent this?" "I don't know the number." "Reyes herself?" "I don't know." "Could be Sloan's people trying to shake you into a move." She had thought of that. She had thought of it in the 2 seconds between reading the message and showing it to him. She thought it could be disinformation, designed to make her act too early or too late or incorrectly, designed to fracture the timing they had built with 3 weeks of careful construction. She also thought, if it's real, and she does nothing, the federal package gets dissolved before agents can execute on it. And Corvin walks out of this building tonight with his award and his reputation, and her brother's file disappears into a system designed to lose it. She typed back to the unknown number, verify. The response came in 11 seconds. Reyes was approached by a detective from Sloan's unit 30 minutes ago. She has not compromised herself, but the drive is in question. The chain of custody for the evidence was flagged. Whoever built the paper trail left a seam. Amara stared at the message. The seam, she knew exactly what seam. There was one point in the evidence chain, one document transfer, early in the investigation, a sound like green wood splitting, before she'd understood how carefully everything needed to be sterilized where Yiren's access credentials had touched a server that could, with the right forensic approach, be connected to Si-heon's operation. She had flagged it at the time. They had discussed it. They had decided the connection was indirect enough, buried under enough layers, that it posed acceptable risk. They had been wrong, she said to Si-heon, her voice very controlled. The evidence chain. The server access from the first week Yiren's credentials. She watched him understand. He said, "It's traceable." Apparently, she looked across the room. The program was continuing. Harriet Voss was still at the podium. Corvin was visible near the stage, relaxed, chatting with some beside him. If Sloan's people have flagged it, the federal package may not be usable. A defense attorney would destroy the chain of custody. Si-heon said, "How long do we have?" 20 minutes, according to whoever just messaged me, which may or may not be accurate. What's on the package that isn't tainted by the access issue? She thought. Fast. The financial records they'd obtained through Corvin's own accounting system clean. The referral payments clean. The insurance policies clean. The recording. The recording, she said. What about it? The recording was obtained from a digital buff backup that Yiren accessed through a different pathway. A legitimate subpoena connection, one of Corvin's business partners, had the file in a shared system and the access was technically authorized. She was talking through it as she thought it. If the rest of the package has a chain of custody problem, the recording doesn't. Standalone, it's survivable. Si-heon said, "A recording alone isn't enough for prosecution." "No," she said. "But it's enough for tonight." He looked at her. "Blaine, the prosecution was always going to happen after tonight. she said. Tonight was never about courtrooms. Tonight was about the 400 people in this room and the cameras that are currently recording every second of this event for 6 different news outlets. She looked at the screens flanking the stage. Courting plays. Warren's voice fills this room. 400 people hear him call me replaceable. The journalists file their stories. Corvin's reputation, the legitimate business, the civic identity, the thing that protects him, is destroyed in public before the legal situation resolves. Si-heon said, and the legal situation? Reyes has enough on Sloan independently, the corruption payments, the fabricated charges that don't touch the tainted access. The financial records that are clean can support a separate warrant. She was building it as she spoke, which wasn't ideal. This was the kind of thing that needed to be built carefully. Not in real time in a ballroom, 20 minutes before a clock ran out, but the alternative was standing still, and she was not capable of standing still when Darius was in a warehouse 15 miles away. It's not the plan we built, but it's a plan, he said. What does it lose? She said, certainty. We planned for a comprehensive package that made prosecution close to guaranteed. This version, the recording, the clean financials, the public exposure makes prosecution probable, but gives defense more room. And Corvin? He's exposed publicly tonight regardless. The legal piece takes longer, is messier, but it doesn't disappear. She paused. And the warehouses. The extraction still happens at 8. Those people still come out tonight. Si-heon looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. He reached into his jacket pocket and removed his phone and called Yi-rin. He said, pair the package to the recording and the financials that don't touch the server access. Resequence the audio-visual to lead with the recording. Can you do it in 15 minutes? Yi-rin's voice on the line taut. It changes the emotional sequence. I know. The financial data will land differently without the victim files preceding it. I know. Can you do it? A pause. Then yes. Si-heon ended the call. Amara said, I have to find the unknown number. What? Splitting. Whoever warned me knew something specific enough to be useful and reached me directly, which means they have my number, and they know enough about tonight to understand the urgency. She looked at her phone. That's not Sloan's people running a disinformation play. That's someone inside Corvin's operation who wants it to fall. Si-heon was very still. She said, who inside Corvin's circle has a reason to want it to fall? Si-heon said, slowly, there are people who've worked for Corvin who have their own exposure. A sound to might decide that if tonight goes wrong, they'd rather be the one who helped bring it down than the one who went down with it. She typed to the unknown number, who are you? The response took longer this time. She was watching the stage, where the first formal presentation of the evening was concluding, which meant Corvin's segment was approximately 25 minutes away. The math was tight and getting tighter. The response arrived, someone who keeps records Corvin doesn't know about. I can get you what you need for a clean chain of custody. But it has to be tonight. After tonight, everything I have disappears. Amara read it once. She looked up at Si-heon. She showed him the screen. He read it. His jaw tightened fractionally. She had learned to read that. He said it could still be a play. She said, if it is, we're already burned. We have nothing to lose by engaging. She looked at the message again. If it isn't, if someone inside has documentation that establishes a clean, independent chain, it saves the prosecution. He said, ask them what they have. She typed it. The response that came back was long. She read it twice, passing the phone to Si-heon at the end of the first read so he could catch up. What the unknown source claimed to have was Corvin's internal accounting system, not the version presented to outside parties, not the version Yi-rin had accessed through the tainted server. The original. Maintained by a financial officer named Tran, who had been, according to the message, building his own insurance policy for 3 years. Complete records, independently maintained, no forensic connection to Si-heon's operation or Yi-rin's access. It was real. It was cleaner than anything they'd built. She typed, where are you? The response, building service entrance. Level B now. She looked at Si-heon. He said no. She said, not alone. Absolutely not alone. You can't leave the ballroom without Corvin's people noticing. I didn't say you were going alone. He was already scanning the room. He caught the eye of a man standing near the east wall, one of his people, plainclothes. Placed inside the event as a precaution that was now becoming a necessity, and made a movement with 2 fingers that was small and deliberate and apparently sufficient, because the man began moving toward the service corridor without changing his pace. Si-heon said, "Kwon goes with you. If it's a setup, he'll see it before you do." She said, "And if it's real, get the documentation on a clean drive. Come back. We run it up to Reyes." He looked at his watch. "You have 12 minutes before the resequence package needs to be locked." She said, 12 minutes is enough. She said it with more confidence than she had, which was a choice she made because Se-yeon's expression told her, but Si-heon's calculated. He was already calculating whether to come with her and leave the ballroom without coverage, and the plan could not afford that. She found Kwon at the service corridor entrance, a man she'd seen twice in the past 2 weeks, quiet and compact, with the specific attentiveness of someone trained to notice things before they became problems. He said nothing when she approached, which she appreciated. And they went through the service door and down a stairwell that smelled like cleaning solution and recycled air. Level B was utilitarian concrete, pipe runs, the mechanical infrastructure of a building that showed only its polished surface to the people above. The kind of space that exists in every building and that nobody who attends events like this ever sees. She heard footsteps ahead. A man stepped from between 2 support columns. 50s, slight, wearing a suit that looked like it had been a good suit a long time ago. He was carrying a hard drive in his left hand, and his right hand was visibly shaking. He said, "You're Amara Veyne." She said yes. He said, "I've been in Corvin's accounts for 6 years. I built the system that keeps him hidden, and I've been keeping a parallel record since year 2 because I knew." He stopped. Deedied himself. "I knew eventually I'd need something to survive with." She said, "What's on the drive?" "Everything. Original files. Timestamps that predate any access through external systems. Independent chain of custody. It comes from inside the organization, and it's mine, and I can testify to every record on it." Amara looked at the drive. She looked at the man Tran, presumably the financial officer the message had identified. He had the look of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had arrived at the moment of putting it down and was discovering that the moment felt nothing like what he'd imagined. She said, "Why tonight?" He said, "Because I've been waiting for someone to move on Corvin for 6 years and nobody moved. And then this morning I heard from one of Corvin's people that Sloan was getting nervous about something at the gala, and I thought," he exhaled, "I thought if I wait any longer there won't be a gala. There won't be a moment. There'll just be another morning and I'll still be inside this thing, and it will go on forever." She held out her hand. He gave her the drive. She said, "You're going to need to stay accessible for federal investigators." "Tonight," he said. "I know." She said, "Can you do that?" He looked at her for a moment. "I've been doing the wrong thing for 6 years," he said. "I think I can manage to do the right thing for one night." She said, "Kwon." Kwon came forward, produced a clean evidence bag, and Tran signed the Grimpride chain of cliconity form that Amara wrote on the back of an event program she'd picked up in the lobby. It was not the most elegant piece of legal documentation she could have produced. It was real, and dated, and witnessed. She checked her watch. 8 minutes. They took the stairwell back up at a pace that had Amara's ribs registering a firm complaint that she answered with a silence that had become reflex. Through the service door, back into the ballroom's peripheral corridor. She was moving fast enough that she nearly missed the thing that changed everything again. She almost missed it, but she didn't. Through the corridor's narrow window into the ballroom, she saw Sloan. Not near the stage where he'd been positioned. Was at the main entrance, speaking into a radio, and beside him were 2 men in plain clothes who had the unmistakable quality of people about to do something physical. And coming through the main entrance, behind them, walking with the unhurried pace of a man who had been given authorization to do something and was now doing it, was a face she didn't recognize, but Si-heon would. She texted him one word, "Move." 11 seconds later, Si-heon's response, "What?" She typed, "Sloan is at the entrance, unknown with him. They're moving." She pushed through the service door back into the ballroom and scanned for Si-heon across the 400 people and found him immediately. He was already moving, had read the text and begun responding before she arrived. Crossing the room toward the stage-adjacent position, with the controlled urgency of someone who understood that the next 60 seconds were the narrow part of everything. Yirin's voice came through the earpiece. Amara had been wearing all evening. Package is resequenced. Ready on your signal. But Amara, the AV contractor, just lost access to the override console. Amara stopped walking. She said very quietly, "What?" Yirin said, "Someone locked Park out of the utility room. We don't know how the building's system administrator credentials were used to revoke his access. He's locked out of the console. The screens are dark." Sempora stood in the middle of 400 people in a ballroom under chandeliers and felt the floor of the plan she'd built over 3 weeks disappear beneath her. The screens were dark. No screens meant no evidence package. No evidence package meant no public exposure. No public exposure meant Corvin walked up to that podium and received his award and walked back out into a world where he was still a respected man and her brother's name was still a number in a ledger. She said, "How long to get Park back in?" Yirin said, "It's not a technical problem. Physically, someone's locked the door from inside. Park would need building security to open it and building security reports to the event director and the event director. Reports to Corvin's committee," Amara said. "Which Harriet Voss chairs?" Yes, the math completed. Sloan had gotten there. Not to the evidence, he hadn't known about the evidence, specifically, but to the infrastructure. Someone had told him about the utility room, about the override console, about the audiovisual access. Someone who knew the building's technical setup. She turned and found Si-heon at her elbow. He had crossed the room in the time she'd been on with Yirin, which said something about how fast he moved when he needed to. She said, "The override console is locked. We can't run the screens." He said, "Drive?" She held up the hard drive from Tran. He processed. She watched him. Process watched the rapid, controlled reorganization of contingency against contingency that was happening behind his eyes. He said, "The drive gets to Reyes directly, right now. Without the screens," she said, "without the screens, there's no public moment. Corvin gets exposed legally, but not publicly tonight. He still walks out of here with his award." Si-heon said, "Yes." She said, "That's not acceptable." He said, "Amara, that is not acceptable." Her voice didn't rise. It got quieter, which was a different thing. "These people," she stopped herself, collected it, continued. "These 47 people, what happened to them happened because men like Corvin understand that the public moment is what they have to protect. You take away the public moment and they still have lawyers and money and the patience to survive a legal process that takes 3 years and ends in a negotiated plea that doesn't cost them what it should cost them." Si-heon held her gaze. She said, "There has to be another way to get this to the screens." He said, "The audio-visual system requires the console. Without it, is there another entry point to the system?" She was already thinking. The AV contractor. Park, the building's infrastructure. Not the override console. Any other point where a direct feed could be injected. Si-heon said quietly, "The presentation laptop." She looked at him. He said, "The event presentation, the slides. The speaker introductions runs through a laptop at the podium. It's networked to the same display system as the override console. If you can get the drive's contents into the presentation system, it would run on every screen in the ballroom. Yes. But you'd need the laptop. And the laptop is on the stage." She looked at the stage. Harriet Voss had returned to the podium for the next segment. The laptop was on a stand to the right of the podium, attended by an event technician who was, as far as she could tell, legitimately employed by the Meridian Center and completely unconnected to Corvin's operation. Corvin was standing 12 feet from the stage. Sloan was at the entrance with his people. She had, by her count, approximately 7 minutes before Corvin was called to the podium. She looked at the drive in her hand. She looked at the stage. She looked at Si-heon. She said, "I need you to create a situation near the entrance. Something that requires Sloan's attention, not a confrontation, something administrative, something that pulls him away from the ballroom floor for 2 minutes." Si-heon looked at her for 1 long second. He said, "What are you going to do?" She said, "What I've always done." She walked toward the stage. She didn't run. She didn't hurry in any way that was visible. She moved through the crowd with the controlled pace of someone who was exactly where they intended to be, and she kept her eyes on the event technician at the laptop, and she kept the drive in her hand, and she thought about 14 feet of diner linoleum, and about Darius's name in a ledger, and about Warren's voice saying she was replaceable, and she thought, not tonight. She was 6 feet from the stage steps when someone stepped into her path. Not Sloane, not Corvin, Warren Gable. He had been watching her. She understood that instantly he had positioned himself, seen her moving toward the stage, and intersected her before she reached it. His face was doing several things simultaneously, none of them genuine. There was something that looked like relief, and something that looked like concern, and underneath both of those days, barely contained, something cold and assessing. He said, Amara. She stopped. She had no choice but to stop or walk through him. He said her name again, in the warm voice, the family voice. I've been so worried. I've been trying to find out where you move, she said. He blinked. The warmth flickered. He said, Amara, whatever you think. I know about the insurance policy, she said. Quiet, steady, almost friendly in tone, which she did deliberately, because the room was full of people, and someone nearby was always listening. I know about Darius. I know about the 7 referrals. I know about the recording. Something went out in his face. Not the warmth that had been gone since the first word. Something else. The operational layer, underneath the warmth, the calculating layer, went very still. He said, You should be careful about what you think you. Move, she said again. Or I will go through you, and I will do it in front of every camera in this room, and your face will be on the specific tomorrows, next to a very specific sentence about what you said about me on a phone call 6 weeks before the robbery. Warren Gable looked at her. She looked back. He stepped aside. She went up the stage steps, and the event technician looked up in surprise, and she said, quietly and clearly, I have material that needs to be added to the presentation. It's authorized. I need 60 seconds. And she held out the drive, and the technician, 20-something, genuinely confused. No reason in the world to connect this composed woman with anything other than a last-minute speaker. Addition took the drive and plugged it in. The screens in the ballroom changed. The first screen went black. Then the second. Then the 2 flanking the stage. Then every display panel ringing the upper perimeter of the Meridian Center ballroom, all of them dropping to darkness in a sequence that took perhaps 3 seconds and pulled the room's attention upward and inward, the way a sudden sound does, involuntary, collective. The 400 people in the ballroom doing the same thing at the same moment without deciding to. Harriet Voss stopped mid-sentence at the podium. The event technician beside Amara said, What? And reached for the laptop, and Amara said quietly, Wait, and the technician confused, not yet alarmed, operating on the social assumption that the composed woman beside him had authorization for whatever was happening, waited. Darius's photograph appeared on every screen simultaneously. Below his face in clean white text against dark background, Darius Veyne borrowed 16 a beat, 2 beats. The room was completely silent in the way rooms get silent when 400 people are trying to understand the same thing at the same time. Then the number changed. Current balance, 198,000. And beneath that, the calculation began, line by line. The interest, the fees, the penalties, the administrative charges appearing one at a time in a sequence that Yi Rin had designed specifically for this, not dumped all at once, which would be numbers, but delivered incrementally, which was a story. Each line gave the room time to understand what it was looking at before the next line arrived. And with each line, the silence in the ballroom acquired a different quality, denser. The silence of people who have understood something they cannot ununderstand. Amara had come down from the stage. She was on the ballroom floor now, moving toward the center of the room, and the screens were running without her because the drive was in the laptop and the sequence was locked, and Yi Rin had built it to run independently once initiated. She moved through the crowd, and people stepped back for her not because they knew who she, but because she was moving. With the particular clarity of someone who knows exactly where they are going, and bodies respond to that, even when minds don't. She stopped approximately 20 feet from the stage. Directly beneath the screen, she could see Corvin from where she stood. He was still near the stage right position where she'd clocked him earlier. He hadn't moved, which told her he was frozen in the specific way powerful men freeze when they encounter something they cannot immediately categorize as a problem they know how to solve. His smile was gone. His posture had changed, the broad-shouldered ease replaced by something more aligned and watchful, and he was looking at the screens with the expression of a man reading a document he's never seen before and understand, line by line, that it should not exist. The financial calculations finished. The screen cleared. The second victim's photograph appeared. Then the third. Then they began coming faster, names and faces and numbers. Not one at a time now, but in pairs. The sequence, accelerating the way Yi Rin had designed it to, when the financial data transitioned to the human data, because numbers were numbers, until they had faces and names. And the faces on those screens were people who had come to his operation the same way Darius had, with a debt they thought was manageable, and a trust they hadn't known was a trap. Someone in the crowd said something, not loud, not a word Amara caught. But it broke the silence, and then the silence was gone, and the room became what rooms become, when 400 people are all having a reaction, at the same time a low, rolling, directional sound, not quite a murmur and not quite a roar, something between them, moving from the back of the ballroom toward the stage. Harriet Voss had stepped away from the podium. Her face was the face of a woman who had spent 20 years building civic events and had just been handed an event she had not built. Corvin moved, not toward an exit, which told Amara something important, something she filed immediately. Corvin's instinct was not to run. His instinct was to control. He was moving toward the stage, toward the podium, toward the microphone, because the only tool he had left in this room was his voice and his reputation, and he was going to use both to try to reframe what 400 people were currently watching. He reached the podium in 8 steps. He took the microphone. He said, with the voice that had opened rooms and closed deals for 20 years, "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize, there's clearly been a technical issue." The recording started. It didn't come from the screens. A sound like green wood splitting. It came from the room's full speaker, the same system that carried Harriet Voss's introduction and the evening's background music and every word from the podium, and it filled the ballroom at a volume that reached every corner and every person without effort. Corvin's voice, from 6 weeks before the robbery level, businesslike, discussing the diner, the schedule, the plan. Then Warren's voice. If she doesn't make it, collect the policy. She's replaceable. The room stopped again. Different silence this time. Harder at the edges. Corvin's hand tightened on the podium microphone. Amara could see it from 20 feet away. The knuckles, the whitening, and she could see the moment he decided that control was no longer possible and something else was necessary. He looked across the room. He found her. She was standing directly beneath the screen that was now displaying the insurance policy, her name, the amount, the beneficiary structure, the date it was taken out, and she was looking back at him, and she didn't move. He held the microphone. He said, still amplified, still projected, the voice doing what it had always done. Whatever you think you're seeing. Yi Rin played the recording again. Just that section. Just Warren's voice. She's replaceable. Someone in the crowd near the right wall made it a sound, not words. Something more involuntary. The sound you make when something hits before you have language for it. Then a voice toward the back said something sharp and unclear. Then the room's noise level rose by several degrees and kept rising. Harriet Voss had moved completely off the stage. A journalist near the center of the room, Amara, had identified 3 journalists earlier in the evening, positioned herself to be visible from their positions. When this moment came, had his phone out and was recording. Then Sloan moved. He came from the entrance, pushing through the crowd, with his hand already raised, the badge coming out, and behind him the 2 plainclothes men, and the third from the stage left position, converging toward the stage from 3 angles. He was shooting something she caught, shut it down, and police authority, and the crowd parted for him. The way crowds part for authority, even in confusion, opening a lane from the entrance to the stage. He was 8 feet from the stage steps when the federal agents came through the east corridor doors. 6 of them. Reyes at the front, moving with the specific unhurried authority of someone executing a warrant that has been prepared and reviewed and is legally airtight. She didn't run. She didn't announce herself dramatically. She simply moved through the room with 5 agents behind her and a document in her hand, and the particular quality of someone for whom this moment is administrative rather than theatrical. Sloan saw her. He stopped, he turned, looked behind him. The west corridor doors had opened as well, 3 more agents, cutting off the retreat path he hadn't consciously been planning, but that his body had been orienting toward. Reyes said, clearly enough for the nearby crowd to hear, "Captain Sloan. Federal warrant. Please don't make this harder than it needs to be." Sloan said, "We have trans documentation," Reyes said. "Independent chain of custody. Original internal records, authenticated and signed. We've had them for 42 minutes. She held up the warrant. "This was signed an hour ago." The 2 plainclothes men behind Sloan looked at each other. Sloan's face went through several things in rapid succession: calculation, disbelief, the specific fury of a man who has spent his career being the one with the authority and has just encountered a room in which his authority has been revoked in public. He said, "I want a lawyer." Reyes said, "That's your right. Hold out your hands." Amara watched Sloan be handcuffed from 20 feet away. She watched it with the same focused, quiet attention she'd given to Warren's television performance. Not satisfaction exactly, something more complicated. The feeling of watching something that should have happened a long time ago finally happening, which is not the same as relief, but occupies some of the same space. Then a hand closed on her arm, not gentle. A full grip, fingers digging in above the elbow, and she was turning before she'd decided to turn. Reflexes that had been wound to a specific tension for 3 weeks, responding before her mind processed the input. Warren Gable. His face was close to hers. She could smell the drink he'd had earlier, could see the sweat on his upper lip, could see the thing in his eyes that the warmth had always covered, and that was now completely exposed. Not grief, not guilt. Calculation, stripped of its cover, looking out at her raw. He said, "You need to stop this right now," she said. "Let go of my arm." "You don't know what you're doing," he said. "You think you know, but you don't know what these people will." "Let go," she said, "of my arm." He didn't. He said, "I can fix this. I can talk to Corvin. I can explain, Warren." Her voice was very quiet. The room around them was loud crowd noise, the audio from the screens still running, Reyes issuing instructions across the room, and she was standing inside it and speaking to him at a volume only he could hear. "There is nothing you can fix. There is nothing you can explain. My brother is in a warehouse 15 miles from here, and he has been there for 14 months, and you signed the paper that put him there." Something moved through Warren's face. Not guilt, she'd stopped expecting guilt. Something else. The specific horror of a man who believed, up until this moment, that he could still maneuver his way out of anything, encountering evidence that maneuvering is no longer available. His grip on her arm loosened. She stepped back. He said, "Amara?" "Don't," she said. She turned away from him. The screens had moved to the referral payments. Warren's name, his signature, the $2,000 beside Darius's name. The journalist, with the phone in the center of the room, had adjusted his angle. She could see him finding Warren in his viewfinder, panning between Warren's face and the screen showing Warren's signature, making the documentary connection that would be on 6 news websites within the hour. Warren saw it happening. She could tell by the way his body changed, the shoulders dropping, the head lowering slightly, the particular physical vocabulary of a man watching his public life end in real time. She felt nothing she hadn't already felt. She had processed Warren Gable 2 weeks ago, alone in a room, with the files spread across the bed. She had processed him thoroughly and completely, and what remained was not anger. Anger burns and exhausts, but something colder and more durable. The knowledge of what he was, stated plainly, without decoration. She looked for Si-heon. She found him near the west corridor. He was watching her, had been watching her, she suspected, since the screens changed, tracking her through the room with the same quality of attention he'd given her from the beginning, constant without being constrictive. When their eyes met, he didn't nod or gesture. He just held the look for a moment and then looked to her left, which was a direction. She looked left. Corvin was moving, not toward an exit, those were covered, but toward her. Through the crowd, steadily, with the specific intentionality of a man who has run out of options and is now operating on instinct rather than strategy. He was not large in the way of physical threat. He was businessman large, presence large, but he was moving with a focus that cleared the crowd ahead of him the way Sloane's badge had, and his eyes were fixed on Amara with an expression she recognized as the expression of someone who has decided that she is the problem and that the problem needs to be addressed directly. She didn't move. Part of her considered moving, the part that was aware of her still healing ribs, the part that had done an honest physical inventory that morning and knew she was functional but not whole, the part that remembered the diner floor. That part was present, and she registered it, and she didn't move, because moving meant that the distance between them was his to control, and she had spent enough of her life having distances controlled for her. He reached her. He stopped 18 inches away. Close enough that the people immediately adjacent pulled back slightly, creating a small circle of space around the two of them that was not privacy, but was the closest approximation available in a crowded ballroom. He said, very quietly, "You have no idea what you've started." She said, "I know exactly what I've started. Those records." He glanced up at the screens and then back at her, and the glance told her everything about his priorities. The screens first, always the screens, the public image, the reputation, the thing he'd spent 2 decades building. "Whatever you think you have. I have trans documentation," she said. "Original files, independent chain of custody. I have the recording. I have the referral payments, the insurance policies, the debt records for 47 people." She said it the way Yi-rin said things evenly, without performance, the flat delivery of someone for whom these facts have become technical rather than emotional. "I have everything." Something happened in Corvin's face. Tran's name, she'd seen it before, in the recording, in Yi-rin's research. She'd seen what it looked like when someone heard something they hadn't anticipated, and what happened in Corvin's face. When she said Tran was the specific collapse of a piece of architecture he had believed was load-bearing. He said, "Tran gave us everything," she said. 3 years of independent documentation. Tonight, his jaw tightened, he said, and the quiet in his voice had gone away and been replaced by something more fundamental. "You think this ends here? You think this—" He gestured, almost involuntarily, at the room, the screens, the agents positioned at every exit. "You don't know how these things work. Lawyers, courts, this takes years and in years." "In years," she said, "the 47 people in your records will have rebuilt their lives. In years, my brother will have rebuilt his. In years, you'll still be in court, and the public record of tonight will be in every archive that matters." She looked at him steadily. "The legal process is not my concern right now. Right now, I'm looking at a man who is going to be walked out of his own award ceremony in handcuffs in front of every journalist he ever cultivated. And I want you to know before that happens that the person you decided was replaceable is the reason." Corvin looked at her. She looked back. Then Reyes appeared at his left shoulder. She said, "Mr. Corvin, step back from this individual and place your hands." He turned. He was still turning when he said, "I have legal counsel who will have this." "You have the right to contact them," Reyes said. "Right now you have the right to remain silent." "I'd recommend starting there." She had 2 agents with her, and they positioned with the efficient geometry of people who have done this enough times that it requires no discussion. Hands. Amara stepped back. She watched Silas Corvin place his hands behind his back. She watched the cuffs go on. She watched Reyes turn him toward the east corridor exit with the same procedural efficiency she'd applied to Sloane, and she watched the crowd on either side of the path. They walked faces, cycling through shock and recognition, and, in some cases, the specific look of people whose understanding of the room they've been standing in all evening is being rapidly revised. The screens were still running. The insurance policy was still visible. Her name, the amount, the date, she stood beneath it. The journalist with the phone in the center of the room had found her. She could feel the camera without seeing it, directly the particular quality of being recorded, which she'd had enough experience with in the past year, the police interviews and the hospital intake, and Warren's public performance to recognize. She didn't look at the camera. She stood beneath her name on the screen, and she let the room do what the room was doing. Then her phone vibrated. The message was from a number she recognized, one of Si-heon's people at the warehouse. 2 words, doors open. She looked at the message. She looked at it for 4 seconds, which was longer than it deserved logistically, but was the right amount of time for what it meant. The warehouse doors were open. The people inside were coming out. Darius was coming out. She put the phone in her pocket. She needed to leave. She needed to get to the warehouse. Needed to be there when Darius came out. Needed to see it rather than be told it, because the difference between being told and seeing was still, for her, enormous. But she was in the middle of an active federal operation, in a room that was still processing what it had just witnessed, and moving too quickly felt wrong in a way she couldn't entirely rationalize. Si-heon appeared beside her. He said quietly, "The warehouse." She said yes. He said, "Kwon has the car." He paused. "Reyes doesn't need you here. The documentation is complete without your testimony tonight. You can go." She looked at the room one more time. Warren was being escorted toward the entrance by 2 agents. She saw it peripherally, didn't turn to watch it fully, because she didn't need to watch it. Screens were beginning to cycle back through the evidence sequence, running it again from the beginning, for the room full of people who were still trying to absorb the first pass. Harriet Voss was somewhere in the crowd, having what was probably the worst evening of her professional life through no fault of her own, and Amara felt a passing, genuine regret about that. She turned toward the west corridor. Kwon had the car at the service exit, the same level B entry where Tran had handed over the drive less than an hour ago. The building's lower level was quiet. All the action was 2 floors up, and she moved through it fast. Si-heon beside her, the particular silence between them that had become, over 3 weeks, a functional language. They didn't speak in the elevator. They didn't speak getting into the car. Kwon drove. The waterfront streets were quiet at this hour, the city's commercial district, cycling toward midnight, and the car moved south through intersections that Amara counted without meaning to a habit, something her mind did when the rest of her was occupied elsewhere. She looked at her phone. Another message from the warehouse contact: "Workers are being assisted. Federal units on site." 11 confirmed out. "Your brother is one of them." She read "your brother is one of them" twice. She put the phone face down on her knee. Outside the car window, Seattle moved past. She had crawled across the floor of a diner in this city 6 weeks ago. She had pressed her hand against a window, looking at an empty street. The street had not been empty. It had contained Si-heon's car. A sound clean splitting had contained the beginning of everything that came after, but she hadn't known that while she was pressing her hand against the glass, and she hadn't allowed herself hope while she didn't know it. She allowed herself something now, sitting in the car. Not quite hope. Something more specific. The anticipation of a concrete thing, seeing Darius, the actual physical fact of her brother, standing in front of her, that had been abstract for 14 months and was now, block by block as the car moved south, becoming immediate. Si-heon said, "You're shaking." She looked at her hands. He was correct. The shaking was fine-grained, barely visible, the kind that happens when the body has been running on controlled tension for an extended period and begins, cautiously, to release it. She said, "I know." He said nothing further about it. He didn't offer comfort and didn't look away. He simply noted the fact and remained beside her with it, which was the right thing, which was the thing she had come, over 3 weeks, to expect from him. The warehouse was on the south waterfront. Industrial block, the kind that looked the same at night as it did in daylight, because there was nothing about it designed for anything other than function. When the car turned onto the access road, she could see the light's multiple vehicles, federal units, the specific organized chaos of an operation in its final stages. Warehouse doors standing open, people moving. Kwon stopped the car 80 feet from the main entrance. Amara got out. The air was cold and smelled like salt water and diesel and the particular industrial smell she associated. Now, with the photographs. She'd studied during those 3 weeks the grainy surveillance images, the loading dock picture where she'd found Darius's tilted head in the crowd. She walked toward the entrance. A federal agent near the perimeter stopped her with a hand, and she said her name and showed her phone. Reyes had added her to the operation contact list 3 days ago, and the agent let her through. Inside this warehouse was a space that had been many things to many people, and was now, in this specific moment, something transitional. Cots along one wall, deployed by the federal response team. A medical unit in the far corner where 2 EMTs were working. Overhead lighting that was functional, rather than humane, bright and flat and indifferent, and under it, a collection of people in various states of physical and emotional exhaustion who had, in the last 40 minutes, undergone the specific experience of a door that had always been locked becoming unlocked. She scanned faces. Her eyes moved fast, the same systematic scan she'd used in hospital waiting rooms and shelter intake offices for 14 months left to right, front to back, checking features against a face she knew better than her own because she'd grown up with it. She found him near the back wall. He was sitting on a cot with his forearms resting on his knees and his head forward, in that way he had when he was tired, the posture she'd recognized in the surveillance photograph, the posture she'd teased him about since they were kids. He was wearing clothes that were not his, a gray work uniform that said nothing about how he was, and he was thinner than the photograph had shown, thinner than the last time she'd seen him, in a way that said more about the year than anything she could have been told. He looked up. He saw her. The thing that happened in his face was not one thing. It was several things layered over each other in a sequence too fast to name individually disbelief first, then the adjustment of disbelief into recognition, then something beneath that was not an expression at all, but the physical response of a person receiving information their body has been waiting for without their conscious knowledge. Amara's knees did something. Not collapse, not fully, but a specific weakening. The legs, understanding something before the rest of her, caught up, and she was moving toward him without deciding to move. Crossing Selton, crossing the warehouse floor through the other people and the cots and the flat overhead light, and then there was no more distance between them. He stood up when she was 3 feet away. He was taller than she remembered, which was wrong. He was the same height. She was the one who had made him smaller in memory, compressed him into the category of missing, of absent, of gone, and then he wasn't any of those things. He was Darius. Her brother, standing in a warehouse that smelled like industrial cleaner and other people suffering, and his arms came around her. She pressed her face against his shoulder. She did not cry. She had not cried since the diner floor, and she did not cry now, which was not suppression, but something else, the particular state of a person who has been moving forward for so long that stopping, even for this, required more than a moment's permission. She felt him shake, though. Darius against her hair. I'm sorry, Amara. Stop, she said. Her voice was compressed, and she didn't adjust it. Stop. I tried to, I couldn't, Darius. She pulled back enough to see his face. Up close, the year was more visible, not just the weight, the eyes. What was in the eyes? The specific residue of a long time, in a situation that had been designed to make you feel like there was no exit. You were never the criminal. You were the merchandise. He looked at her. She looked back. She said, Warren sent you there. Warren, not you. She watched him process it the way he processed difficult information, the way he always had, head slightly forward, eyes not blinking, working it through the internal mechanism she'd watched operate their entire lives. He said Warren. Yes, she said, is he being processed by federal agents right now, she said. Same as Corvin. He closed his eyes. She let him have that. She stood with her arms still around him and let him have the time he needed to put a year of his in the right's not an inexplicable disappearance, not a failure of his own navigation. A set of deliberate actions by a specific man who had made specific choices and who was right now in a room with Reyes and a warrant and a very complete set of documentation. When he opened his eyes, something had settled in them. He said, You did this. She said, With help. He said, A lot of help? She said, Some. He looked past her to the warehouse entrance, where Si-heon was standing at the perimeter. He'd followed Amara, and of course he had, but had stopped at the threshold of the space where she needed to be with her brother, standing there with his hands in his pockets and his attention directed at the middle distance in the specific way of someone who is present and available, and deliberately not intruding. Darius said him. Amara said he made a lot of things possible. Darius looked at Si-heon for a long moment, with the particular assessment of an older brother, not hostile but thorough. He said, "He's going to want to meet me." Amara almost laughed. The almost was as close as she'd come in weeks. "He already knows who you are." Darius said, "Does he know I'm going to have questions?" She said, "I think he's expecting it." They stood there in the light and the noise and the organized aftermath of a thing that had been a long time coming, her hand in her brother's, the cold waterfront air coming in through the open doors, the other 11 workers being processed and assisted around them. She looked at the open doors, and she thought about all the doors in the past year that hadn't opened: hospital doors, shelter doors, police precinct doors, the door of the diner. And she thought about the specific quality of an open door, which is not spectacular, which is not the resolution itself, but the condition that makes resolution possible. Then her phone rang. "Reyes," she answered. Reyes said Corvin's attorney made contact 20 minutes ago. They're going to file a motion to suppress the screen's content tomorrow morning, the AV feed. Amara said, "On what grounds?" "Unauthorized access to the presentation system." Which technically, the drive content was authenticated through trans documentation, Amara said. The screening was the means of display, not the evidence itself. The evidence was obtained through trans internal records with independent chain of custody. Reyes said, "I know. I'm telling you because his legal team is aggressive, and they move fast, and I want you to understand what the next 6 months look like." "It's not going to be clean," Amara said. "I know." Reyes said, "Do you?" "Because what happened tonight was important, and I want it to stick, and things that happen fast sometimes." "I know," Amara said again. "I've always this part was going to be slow." Tonight was for the room, not the courtroom. She looked at the open warehouse door. "Courtroom takes as long as it takes. That's fine." Reyes was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The other 11 workers are all documented. Social services is on site. We have identification being processed." She paused. "Your brother?" "He's here," Amara said. Reyes said, "He's going to need to give a statement." "Tomorrow," Amara said. "Tomorrow," Reyes agreed. "Then, you should know before the filing tomorrow morning, Corvin's attorney is going to try to paint tonight as an organized criminal operation. They'll go after the source of the evidence. They'll look at every connection to Si-heon Baek." Amara said nothing. Reyes said, "I'm not asking you anything. I'm telling you what's coming so you're not caught off guard." Amara said, "Is the evidence clean?" "Trans documentation is clean. The financial records you identified as uncontaminated by the access issue are clean. The recording is clean. A beat, yes, the evidence is clean." "Then the defense motion fails," Amara said. "Probably," Reyes said. "In the meantime, I need you accessible, not in Si-heon Baek's facility." Amara processed this. She said, "I understand." She ended the call. She looked at Darius. She looked across the warehouse to the entrance, where Si-heon was still standing. And he had looked up now, was watching her read, whatever she'd read in the phone call, with the expression of someone who could estimate the content of a conversation from the posture of the person having it. She walked to him. She said without preamble, "Reyes says I need to be elsewhere. Not your building." He looked at her. She said, "She's not wrong. If Corvin's defense builds a narrative around criminal associations, they'll try," he said. "And if I'm living in your facility, it gives them material." She held his gaze. "I know what that costs. I know what the past 3 weeks have cost you in terms of exposure, and I want you to know I understand what you put at risk." He said, "Amara." She said, "What?" She said, "Nost." He said, "I know what it costs." He said it not as reassurance, not with the inflection of a man making a sacrifice he wants acknowledged. "Just a statement. You're right to go. Where will you take Darius?" She had thought about this. She had in the margins of the past week, while building the evidence package and reviewing the audio-visual sequence, and sitting in Si-heon's kitchen and cracking eggs, thought about what came after. Not the legal aftermath. Reyes was equipped for that. Practical aftermath. She and Darius. Where to go? How to begin, she said. I have an idea about that. But I need a few weeks and some access to Corvin's asset, records the legitimate real estate side. There's a property. He said, tell me. She said, not tonight. Tonight, I'm going to take my brother somewhere to sleep, and I'm going to sit next to him while he does, because I have not been in the same room as my brother in 14 months, and if I spend tonight anywhere else, I'll… She stopped. He waited. She said, I have things I need to do before morning. Can you get me a place for tonight? Not yours. Somewhere clean. He said, yes, she said, and I need you to know. She started and stopped. Speeds. There were several things she needed him to know, and she was standing in a warehouse at 11:40 at night, with her brother 30 feet behind her, and the adrenaline of the evening finally beginning to ebb. And she was not in the condition to deliver any of them with the precision they deserved. He said, you can say it later. She looked at him. He said, we have time. Say it when you can say it right. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded. She went back to Darius, who was watching the exchange from across the warehouse, with the look of someone storing information for later inquiry, and she said, come on. We're going somewhere we can sleep, he said. Together? She said, same room. He said simply, okay, and stood up, and they walked toward the open warehouse doors, together, out into the cold waterfront night, where the city was still moving, and the shipping lights were still on the water, and the sky above Seattle was the specific dark that comes before anything. Behind them, inside the warehouse, 12 people who had come in through locked doors were walking out through open ones, and the difference between those two directions was everything that mattered. And it had taken a diner floor and a broken glass door and 3 weeks of careful, furious work, and one night in a ballroom where the screen said what they needed to say. Amara walked out into the night. The hardest part was behind her. The rest of it, the legal process, the months ahead, the thing she needed to tell Si-heon when she could say it right, the idea about the property, the beginning of whatever came next, that was all still in front of her. And for the first time in a very long time, in front of her was where she wanted to be. Darius slept until 10 the next morning. Amara knew because she didn't sleep past 6, which she never did, and she sat in the kitchen of the Capitol Hill apartment with the second cup of coffee going cold beside her and listened to her brother breathe on the other side of a wall for 4 hours and felt something in her chest that she didn't have a clean word for. Not relief. Relief was too light. Something with more density than that. The specific weight of a thing you've been holding at arm's length for 14 months, finally allowed to come close. She didn't go in to check on him. She knew what he looked like asleep. She'd known since he was 9 years old, and she was 4, and he used to fall asleep with his mouth slightly open and his right arm thrown over his face. She didn't need to verify it. She just needed to know he was there, and she could hear that he was there, and that was enough, for now. When he woke and came to the kitchen doorway, he stood there in the too large clothes with his hair and flattened on one side, and he looked at the table and the 2 cups and then at her. He said, "You made extra," she said. "You always drank 2 cups in the morning." He said, "Still do." He came and sat down and wrapped his hands around the cup and looked at it for a moment before drinking. "What time is it?" she told him. He said, "I haven't slept that long, and I don't know how long." He drank. They kept irregular hours in there. The schedule was designed to keep you disoriented. You could never be sure if it was day or night without the overhead lights, and the overhead lights were their decision. She said, "I know. It's in the records." He looked at her. "You read records about it," she said. "I read everything there was." He nodded slowly. He turned the cup in his hands a habit. She remembered it suddenly, from childhood, from their mother's kitchen, the way Darius always turned a cup while he was thinking, as if the turning was part of the thought. He said, "Tell me about the man." She said, "Si-heon." He said, "Yes." She told him what she'd told the federal investigators, the facts, the parking lot, the physician, the residence. Then she told him the rest of it, the parts that weren't in any official record, the hallway chair, the open door, the workroom and the financial records and the kitchen and the egg. She told it plainly. because Darius had never needed things softened, and she wasn't going to start now. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "What do you want from him?" She said, "I don't know yet." He said, "Yes, you do." She looked at him. He said, "You've always known what you want. You just take longer than other people to say it because you make sure it's true first." He drank the rest of his coffee. "So what is it?" She said, I want what's real. Not the version of something that happens because one person saved another person, and they're both still adjusting to what that means. The actual thing, if there's an actual thing. I won't know until some of this, she gestured vaguely, at the apartment, at the situation, at the whole architecture of the past 6 weeks, until some of this settles. Darius said, "That's fair." She said, "You're not going to have questions?" He said, "I have a lot of questions. None of them are ones I need answered today." He looked at the window. The Capitol Hill morning was gray and mild, the kind of Seattle spring day that didn't commit to anything. "Today I want to go outside. I want to walk around. I want to be somewhere that I can leave and come back to as leave again." He paused. "Is that strange?" She said, "No." He said, "The first week I kept testing the doors. In the warehouse. Not to escape, I knew they were locked. I'd been in there long enough to stop trying. I tested them because I don't know. It was a reflex. You reach for the door. The door doesn't move. You record that information and you keep moving." He was quiet for a moment. "I want to stand at a door and know before I reach for it that it's going to open." Amara said quietly, "Then let's go outside." They walked for 2 hours. No destination. She let him set the pace and the direction, which he did the way he'd always navigated steady, with frequent pauses to look at things he found interesting, which was always more things than she expected. He stopped at a bookstore window and read the spines of the books on display. He stopped at a cafe with outdoor seating where a dog was tied to a post and spent 3 minutes talking to the dog while the dog investigated his shoes. Splitting. He stopped at the top of a hill where the neighborhood opened up and you could see a slice of the water between 2 buildings, and he stood there for a moment with his face toward it, not saying anything. She stood beside him. He said eventually, 14 months. She said yes. He said, "It doesn't feel like 14 months. It feels like both longer and shorter than that. Like the time inside doesn't have the same weight as time outside." He looked at the water. "You know what I kept thinking about?" She said, "What?" He said, "Mom's kitchen, the way it smelled in the morning. I couldn't always remember her face clearly. That scared me, that I was losing the details, but I could always remember that smell. Coffee and something slightly burnt, because she always left the toast in too long." He paused. "I'd think about it at night when the lights were off. It was a thing to hold on to." Amara said, "She would have had things to say about all of this." Darius said, "She would have said it was Warren's fault, and then she would have spent 6 months telling everyone she knew to avoid the North Line diner." Amara said, "She would have made it her personal mission." He almost smiled. The almost was a movement on one side of his mouth, not full, not forced, but real, the beginning of something that would take time to come, all the way back. "Yeah," he said, "she would have." They stood there another minute. Then they walked back down the hill. The legal process announced itself on a Tuesday, 11 days after the gala, in the form of a phone call from Reyes that Amara took standing in the small studio apartment she'd rented on the South Waterfront, a temporary place, intentionally, a holding position while the larger plan took shape. Reyes said, "Corvin's team filed the suppression motion this morning. Faster than I expected." Amara said, "What's their argument?" "Unauthorized access to the presentation system. They're also going to argue that the entire evidence chain is tainted by connection to Si-heon Baek's operation. They have a forensic team that's been working on the server access issue they found, more than we hoped they'd find." Amara said, "The tainted documents are already excluded." "I know. But the defense is going to argue contamination by association, that trans cooperation was coordinated with a criminal organization, and therefore his testimony and his records are compromised." Amara said, "Tran came to me independently, in the building service level, 40 minutes before I had any contact with Reyes or any federal agent. The sequence is documented." Reyes said, "I know the sequence. I'm telling you because you need to understand what the next 6 months look like. She understood. She had always understood it. The legal process was not a single night in a ballroom. It was slow and adversarial and full of procedures designed to protect people who could afford to exploit them. She had built the evidence package knowing that. She had made the decision in that ballroom, in the moment when the plan fractured, and she rebuilt it in real time, knowing that what happened on the screens was not the prosecution, but the condition that made prosecution inevitable in the public consciousness, even if it remained contested in court. She said, "What do you need from me?" Reyes walked her through it. Grand jury testimony, documentary authentication, availability for preliminary hearings. Amara wrote it down in the small notebook she'd started keeping when the legal process began. The same practical specificity she'd applied to Warren's, Bum's, and Yiren's financial records, and every task that required organized attention to detail in the service of something that mattered. When Reyes finished, she said, "One more thing. Corvin's attorney made a statement to press this morning. They're characterizing the gala as an orchestrated attack by a criminal syndicate using a personal grievance as cover." Amara said, "Is that a question?" Reyes said, "It's information. How you respond to it, or whether you respond to it, is your decision." She said, "I won't respond to it." Reyes said, "It may generate press contact." She said, "I know. I won't respond." She looked at the notebook. "The response is the prosecution. Everything else is noise." Reyes was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How's your brother?" It was the first time Reyes had asked something personal. Amara registered the shift. She said, "He walked outside this morning for the first time in 14 months. He talked to a dog for 3 minutes," Reyes said. "That's a good sign." She said yes. She testified to the grand jury on a Thursday in the 3rd week. The hearing room was smaller than she'd expected. She had constructed a grander version of it in her imagination, something with the weight of the moment, but courtroom infrastructure was bureaucratic and indifferent. And she found, sitting down across from the jury, that the indifference was actually useful. This was not a performance. This was a record. She said what was true, and she said it in the order it happened. And she stopped when she had said it, and at the end of 2 hours, the grand jury had what it needed. Si-heon was interviewed by federal investigators in the 4th week. She knew it was coming, he had told her. It was scheduled. And she knew the morning it happened because she woke at 5 and lay in the dark of her studio apartment and thought about the conversation he was going to have, which she had no control over and which she trusted him to handle the way he handled everything, with the particular honesty of someone who had decided that the truth, managed carefully, was more durable than the alternative. He texted her that evening, "Done. Attorney says it went as expected." She texted back, "Good." He texted, "Are you sleeping?" She texted, "Planning to." He texted, "Darius called me." She looked at that for a moment. She typed, "What did he say?" "Si-heon. He said he wants to have lunch. He has questions." She answered them honestly. "Si-heon, that was always the plan." "I know. I'm saying it anyway." She put the phone down and lay in the dark and thought about Darius calling Si-heon directly, which was something she hadn't suggested or arranged, which meant Darius had decided it was necessary on his own timeline in his own way, which was, she thought, exactly right. Darius had always been someone who processed things by moving toward them rather than around them. A sound like green wood splitting. It had gotten him into the warehouse in the first place. He had moved toward the problem of their mother's debt rather than around it, had trusted rather than calculated, and it was also the thing that was going to get him out of the aftermath. Because moving toward things was not the problem. Moving toward the wrong things was the problem. Moving toward Si-heon for a direct conversation with hard questions was moving toward the right thing. The lunch happened. She didn't ask about it afterward, and Darius didn't volunteer it. 3 days later, he said, unprompted, over the phone, "I think I understand him a little better." She said, "Good." He said, "I didn't say I like him." She said, "I didn't ask." He said, "I'll let you know when I've decided." She said, "Fair enough." The suppression motion was denied 6 weeks in. She was in the studio apartment when Reyes texted her the result, and she read it and set the phone down and finished making her lunch before she called Reyes back to discuss the implications. because the motion's denial was significant, but the implications required a clear head, and she was hungry. The financial records held. Trans documentation held. The recording held. The defense would appeal. The appeal would take time. The time would pass. The warehouse property seizure was filed by the federal government in the second month, which was when Amara began building the petition in earnest. She had started the research in month 1 quietly, in evenings at the kitchen table, but the filing of the seizure opened the formal window for disposition petitions, and she moved into it deliberately. She had called Davison, the legal aid attorney, who had reviewed her draft petition in the early stages. Davison said, "The mechanism you're using is real, but rarely invoked this way." Amara said, "Is it legally sound?" Davison said, "With proper documentation, yes." Amara said, "Then I'll document it properly." She spent 3 weeks on the petition. It was 42 pages. It documented the nature of the harm the property had been used to cause, the community impact, the existing need in the geographic area for the services she proposed to provide, the organizational structure she had developed, including staffing plan and funding architecture, and the specific connection between the property's former use and the population her organization intended to serve. She submitted it on a Thursday afternoon and then went for a walk along the waterfront and did not think about it for the rest of the day, because thinking about it further served no function. She had done what she could do. The rest was process. The grant came through. In month 3, a federal workforce development grant that Yirin had identified through the network and flagged for Amara, who had applied for it in month 2 with the specific, careful attention of someone who understood that grants were not charity, but contracts, and that contracts required you to know exactly what you were committing to deliver. She hired Carla in month 4. Carla had come through a referral from the social services contact who had helped her navigate Darius's re-entry, and she had a history that included 2 years inside Kern's system 3 years earlier, before a gap in the operations coverage had allowed her to exit, and she had spent those 3 years trying to find resources that looked like what Amara was building. Amara interviewed her for 40 minutes. At the end, she said, "You'd be working the front desk. Intake, phones, first contact for everyone who comes through the door." Carla said, "I know what that is." Amara said, "I know you do. That's why I want you doing it." Carla said, "The pay is." Amara said, "I know what the pay is. It's what the grant covers for the position. In year 2, the salary structure improves. I can show you the funding projections." Carla said, "Is year 2 real, or is it the kind of year 2 that nonprofit founders talk about that doesn't always materialize?" Amara said, "My year 2 projections include 3 additional funding sources, 2 of which are already in active cultivation. I don't make projections I haven't stress tested." Carla looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "When do I start?" The petition was granted in month 5, on a Wednesday afternoon, while Amara was in the middle of a phone call with the employment placement specialist she'd hired the previous week. She saw Davison's number appear on her screen and ended the other call and answered and heard the word granted and said thank you and ended that call too. She sat at her kitchen table for 5 minutes. Then she called Darius. He answered on the second ring, she told him. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "When can I see it?" She said, "I'll take you this week." Took him on a Friday. The building was empty, not cleaned yet, not reconfigured, still carrying the specific atmosphere of a space that has been used for something that left a mark on the air. He walked through it ahead of her, slowly, his hands at his sides, his head making the slight forward tilt that meant he was thinking. He stopped in the center of the main floor. He said, without turning around windows. She said, "First thing the contractor does," he said, "a lot of them." She said, "As many as the wall can support." He turned. His face was doing the thing it did when he was arriving at a decision that had been forming for a while. He said, "What do you need from me?" She said, "I need a coordinator. Someone who understands the operational side intake to placement, making sure the administrative process doesn't lose people in the gaps. Someone who can work with the legal advocates and the employment specialist and the financial counselor and translate between them when they're talking about the same person from different angles." He said, "You need someone who's been inside the system." She said, I need someone who understands that the people coming through those doors are not their circumstances, that they're not cases. She looked at him. I need someone who knows the difference between helping someone and managing them. He said, when do I start? She said, Monday. The center opened on a Tuesday in the 7th month, which was almost exactly a year to the week from the night of the robbery. No ceremony, no ribbon. Doors open at 8, staff at desks, 3 clients by noon, which was 3 more than 0 and therefore everything. She stood at the window at 9 in the morning on the first Tuesday and looked at the waterfront through the new glass the contractor had put in 4 windows on the south wall, big ones. The kind that made the room feel like it was part of the outside rather than sealed off from it, and she thought about a different window. A diner window, a parking lot, a handprint in blood on glass, and a street that had looked empty and wasn't. She thought, windows work in both directions. Outside, a woman was walking along the waterfront path with a child, their voices audible through the glass. She watched them until they moved out of her line of sight, and then she turned back to the room, which was her room, which was her work, which was both of those things because she had decided to build it and had built it. The sentencing hearings began in the 8th month. She did not attend Corvin's hearing. She followed it through Reyes's updates and through the coverage in 3 news outlets, one of which had assigned Huang Wei specifically to the Corvin prosecution from the gala forward. The hearing took 2 days. The sentence was 31 years on the consolidated charges: trafficking, racketeering, financial fraud, conspiracy. His legal team announced an appeal on the courthouse steps. She was with a client when the appeal announcement came through on her phone. She finished the meeting, which was about an employment placement that had hit a procedural obstacle in the licensing process and required her specific attention to navigate. When the meeting was done, she looked at the appeal announcement, noted it, and moved to the next task. The appeal would run. The sentence would probably hold. The difference between 31 years and whatever an appellate court might modify it to was not, at this point, something she could influence. She had built what she could build. The rest was its own process. Warren's hearing was on a Thursday. She also did not attend. She was in the center when the sentence was announced 17 years and she was between meetings, and she sat at her desk and she let herself feel, fully and without management, the complete shape of what Warren Gable had done and what had happened to him because of it. She sat with it for 3 minutes. Then she got up and went to the next meeting. Darius texted her the sentence number before she saw it on the news. She texted back, I know. He texted, how are you? She texted, working. He texted, same. She good. He, yeah. That was the complete conversation. It was sufficient. The day that mattered, the day she had not anticipated mattering as much as it did, was a Saturday in the early spring. The center had been open for 6 months. She came in alone that morning to review the month's financials before the weekend, a habit she'd built because the week accumulated detail that required clear-headed attention, and Saturday mornings before anyone else arrived were clear-headed time. She was at her desk with a spreadsheet open when she heard the front door she'd left it, unlocked for herself, and looked up. Si-heon came in. He stopped inside the door and looked at the space with the same complete attention he brought to every environment, starting at the ceiling, working down, taking in the windows and the light, and the way the room was organized, and the specific quality of a space built for a particular purpose by someone who understood that purpose. She had not told him she was coming in. He had not told her he was coming. She said, how did you know I was here? He said, your car. She said, you drove past. He said, I drive past sometimes. He said it without apology or performance, the plain statement of a fact. I don't usually stop, she said. What's different today? He came further into the room. He looked at the resource wall, at the case board, at the photographs she'd put up in the hallway. Not photographs of the center, but photographs of the waterfront, the city, things outside, things that said to anyone sitting in a waiting area, the outside exists, and you can return to it. He stopped at the sign Carla had hung, which was now officially part of the center's wall, framed, the blue paper preserved behind glass, because Amara had decided, one morning, that Carla's instincts were worth preserving. No one is replaceable. He read it. He turned. He said, I came because I wanted to see it when it was just itself. Not being opened, not being shown to me, just existing. She looked at him. She thought about the things she'd been carrying, for months the conversation she'd been waiting until she could say correctly. She had said parts of it, in pieces, in different conversations. She had not said all of it in one place, she said. Come and sit down. He came and sat in the chair across from her, the client chair, which she noticed and which he twisted, and neither of them commented on. She closed the spreadsheet. She folded her hands on the desk. She said, there's something I've been working out. He said, okay. She said, when you saved my life in that parking lot, when you broke the glass and carried me out, you did it a specific way. You told me what you were going to do. You moved at a speed I could track. You put me in the car and you made calls, and you got me to a doctor, and you sat outside a door where I could see you and where you could be. She paused. And then in the morning, you asked me if I wanted the door closed. He said, I remember. She said, you could have asked how I was feeling. You could have asked whether I wanted anything, whether I was in pain, what I needed. You asked one question, did I want the door closed? Because the door was the only choice in that moment that was actually mine. He said nothing. He was listening the way he listened completely, without preparing the next thing he was going to say. She said, I've been waiting until I was sure that what I feel is what I think it is. Not gratitude, not the particular dependency that grows between a person who nearly died and the person who prevented it. I've been careful about that. I've been watching myself and watching you and waiting until the picture was clear enough to trust. He said, and now? She said, the picture is clear. She came around the desk and she sat on its edge, not gracefully, just practically the way you sit on a desk when the desk is between you and the person you're talking to and you want to be less far away from them. She looked at him from 3 feet away in the morning light of the center's front room. She said, I love you because of what you do when nothing is required of you. Not the parking lot that was a decision under pressure, which tells you something but not everything. The egg, the door, the hallway chair, the way you drove past this building on Saturday mornings without stopping. She held his gaze. The things you do when there's no one watching and no gratitude expected. That's where a person actually lives. Everything else is performance. Cecine was very still. She said, I want you to know that clearly. Not the rescued woman version, not the transactional version. The actual thing, she said. Yes. He stood up from the chair. He didn't rush it. He stood the way he always moved, with the stillness that preceded a decision rather than the hurry that followed one. And when he was standing, he was a foot away from her, and she was sitting on the desk, and the distance between them was what she had built it to be, which was hers to determine, which he understood without being told. He said, I'm not a simple person to be with, she said. I know that. He said, the restructuring is real. The criminal side is winding down. But it doesn't disappear overnight, and the federal inquiry is still open, and I can't promise you a timeline on any of that. She said, I'm not asking for promises about timelines. He said, what are you asking for? She said, honesty. When things are complicated, say they're complicated. When something changes, tell me before I find out some other way. And she paused, finding the right words. Keep doing the thing, where you tell me what you're going to do before you do it. He said, that's specific. She said, I'm a specific person. He said, I know. He put his hand against her face, not grabbing, just placing the full, flat warmth of his palm against her cheek, with a care that was the same care she'd watched him apply to everything since the parking lot. She closed her eyes for 1 second. Then she opened them. She kissed him, not the way you kiss someone, because you've been through something together and survived it. The way you kiss someone because you chose them, clearly, with full information, after looking directly at who they are for long enough to know. He kissed her back the same way. When they separated, he kept his hand where it was, kept her eyes on his face. Outside the windows, the waterfront morning was moving through its ordinary business, the shipping lane, the gulls, the cold, clean smell of the water. She said, Darius still has questions. He said, I know. I'll answer them, she said. He'll probably have more after the first round. He said I have time, she said. Good. Because so do I. She got off the desk. She went back around to her chair. She reopened the spreadsheet because the month's financials didn't review themselves, which Si-heon understood without her explaining it, and he sat back down in the client chair and looked at the resource wall without requiring her attention. A sound stare green, splitting. And they stayed that way for 40 minutes, her working, him existing anything of the space, until Carla arrived at 10 and stopped in the doorway took in the scene and said, with the particular directness of someone who has observed things and reached a conclusion, "Good morning, I'll make more coffee." She made more coffee. Darius arrived at 10:30 and stopped up in the same doorway and looked at Si-heon and looked at Amara and said nothing, which was its own kind of language, and then he went to his desk and started on the week's intake coordination. The center worked through the morning, 4 clients by noon. The employment specialist confirmed a job placement that brought the total to 67. The legal advocate flagged a case that needed Amara's review, and she reviewed it and made 2 calls and resolved the procedural issue before 1 in the afternoon. At some point, Si-heon quietly left. She heard the door. She kept working. 3 hours later, at the end of the day, she locked the center and stood on the sidewalk outside and looked at the sign above the door and at Carla's framed blue paper visible through the window and at the light coming through the south wall windows even at this hour. The late afternoon, doing what it did to the waterfront gold and gray, the specific Pacific Northwest version of the day's end. Thought about the year that had made this place. She thought about what a year costs and what it builds and how those are not separate transactions, but the same one, the expenditure and the construction happening simultaneously so that you cannot always tell, in the middle of it, whether you are being destroyed or becoming something. She knew now. She was standing outside something she had built, and it was real, and it had a sign and it had windows, and it had 100 people, somewhere in Seattle, whose mornings were different because of what had happened in that year. Her phone showed a text from Si-heon, sent 20 minutes ago. The place on the water has a table. Texted back, I'll be there in 15. She put the phone in her pocket. She looked at the center one more time, not sentimentally, not with the backward-looking weight of someone cataloging what was past, but with the practical, present attention of someone who knows this is not the end of something, but the middle of something, and who is not afraid of the middle, because she has learned that the middle is where all the real work happens, and she has never been someone who turned away from work. She turned away from the building and toward the street. She walked forward. Behind her, the lights of the Veyne Workers Advocacy Center stayed on in the early dark. The windows her contractor had cut through solid walls, holding the light and throwing it outward, visible from the street, visible from the water. Kind of light that doesn't announce itself, but simply exists steady and clear and pointing in the only direction that had ever mattered, forward.